that's fine. I mean, since I've had a video, with us for the afternoon. Oh, excellent. Yes, how you've got it all over there.
That came on watching I tried to pass it on to Chris Burton through the internet. And total disaster. I've had it for 3 days. And
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Welcome on behalf of the Community Conservation Society. I'm asked to ask you to fill in the attendance sheet and please join the Community Conservation Society, which amazingly doesn't actually cost you anything. The forms at the front are there. This is a somewhat unusual meeting for the Computer Conservation Society because though we certainly are concerned with conserving machines, we're actually very much concerned with the history of computing, particularly in this country. And I suppose the history of computing in this country without the history of the software industry is a very lame thing. If you sort of go back in this time, the software side was perhaps not totally distinguishable. I mean, we always distinguish Babbage from the work of Ada, but I suspect that really they weren't really all that precisely distinguishable. At Bletchley Park with Colossus, Max Newman's team of about 400 people by the end could, I suppose, be considered to have been an early attempt at creating a programming team. In fact, they did do rather more in the way of programming the machine than is generally realised. I have heard it said that there were 16 different algorithms by the end, though we certainly haven't had anything like that number released to us. But when the actual industry, the computing industry in the sense of the word, got going, I think it's fair to say that for a long time it was very difficult to distinguish externally from the black box people from the software people, because it didn't suit the firms who came from a hardware background to make that distinction. Anyway, it is nice to think that finally the pioneers broke loose in the 1950s and 1960s, and that's what we're here to hear about this afternoon.
Now, Barney Gibbons, pioneer as ever, has volunteered to organise the pioneers. I can't help thinking that since the pioneers never agreed with themselves in the whole history of the software industry, it's improbable that we'll get a common story this afternoon, but I look forward to it. Barney.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You wrote the common story, I'm quite sure. There's a sound man staring up at that. Sound man happy? All right. Good afternoon. How nice to see so many friendly faces. How nice to see so many not terribly young faces. Because it means that probably a lot of you will know quite a lot about the beginning of the UK software industry anyway. So we don't have to go through this business of how to set up a software house. We're not talking about that. Most of you around here know how to do that anyway. But we're just going to listen to the chaps here saying what actually happened as far as they were concerned. Now, it may be their recollection is somewhat different to yours. Would you hang on to your questions and comments until the end? Because at the end we'll have all the protagonists up here, and you can pick away every one of them as you wish. Now, we're talking about the UK software industry, okay? Nobody else, because that's what we're talking about. But do you remember that en passant there was an awful lot happening elsewhere in 1962, which is when we really started our talk as the first of the five that have started. Remember the States, and remember what was happening in the States by then. By 62, there were at least 8 big software houses in the States. You can probably tell me there were 20 more. The ones I could remember just off the top of my head were SDC, we remember from the RAND Corporation working on Sage, Computer Usage, CUC, Computer Science, CSC, PRC, Planning Research, Informatics, UCC, University Computing, ADR, Applied Data Research, and just coming onto the scene in 62, EDS, whoever they are. Now, what we're not doing is talking about any of them, but you have to admit that in 62 we were really rather a long way behind. And this afternoon we'll tell you how we took off and overtook these upstarts in the sort of systems that we built in the early, middle 60s, or in the case of Len Taylor, late 60s. We are very fortunate here in CAP of having a history called Malik on CAP, which was commissioned for our 20th anniversary. And so I've got a lot of good stuff in here. One of the phrases that I must read out, which is straight mad. One of the characteristics, he says, that most of the successful software houses share, and CAP, Hoskins, SPL, CMG, and Logica, the generally acknowledged stars of today's UK software business, who bribed him to write that, were among them, is the existence of the top of what I call the Abbott and Costello syndrome. They're run by twosome. One a front man, usually much seen and quoted in the industry and in the public, and the other a straight man working quietly in the background. So I'm sure the speakers this afternoon will decide which of those two they are. Now, I have to point out, of course, even in those early days, the software was a great deal less robust than the hardware. We used to always blame the hardware for unexplained faults, but normally it was the programmer's fault. However, a week ago today, I was listening to Breakfast TV, and I heard Professor, is he Andrew Ballo of Imperium, talking about what went wrong with the first Ariane 5 rocket, which, if you remember, cost £200 million. It was a software error, said everybody. No, it wasn't, said Professor Andrew Ballo, remember that name. The software worked perfectly, he said. Unfortunately, it was on the wrong rocket. I wish we'd thought of that in the early 60s. All right, after that revivifying quote, the speaker's order was picked on a very random basis called alphabetic, which means that we get Benjamin first and Taylor last. Taylor is quite convinced that he's only going to get 6¼ minutes because everybody else is going to overrun Rob. I shan't allow that. At 20 minutes I shall stand up and make a sound such as, "You've had 20 minutes, you bugger, come on," or something like that, which with any luck will make him wrap up in the next 5. So to bat this all off, we have Alan Benjamin of SPL.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh my God, wait, hold on.
I'm one of the back row boys. Thank you. Now, as Barney said, some of the reminiscences we were asked to prepare will not reek of precision. They are indeed our views, and so that's what they are, and that's what you'll get. I want to preface my remarks about SPL by saying that I came back from South Africa in 1961, having used an ICT HEC4 computer and some senior rolling tabulators there. And I joined ICT in Putney. In fact, it was called the Advanced Systems Group, run by Peter Ellis, who is here today, and who is the reason why I cancelled most of the first 2 pages of my speech. I went to program at Brandon Manor, and I learned the 1301, and for 3 months it was like being on drugs. I knew nothing of what was going on, and suddenly it happened. We worked on proposals for advanced tape, paper tape. And I programmed some applications for the 1301, and then went on to learn the assembly language Plan. And I have to tell you that I wrote and we deployed 2 programs which worked for some considerable time. We were then asked, as a team of 3 people, to try and integrate systems people in our group from EMI, which ICT had taken over. And when doing that, I met Jim Holding, and we formed a new group, Putney. Now, at that stage, we were working on some leads coming in from Salesforce, and we proposed a system to shipping groups in the City of London to build what we call the base of data in those days, of Lloyd's Register, all the ships in Lloyd's Register, which was the publication around the world and which had in its record all the specification of ships. And we were going to put that onto our tapes. We were then going to put on a physical description of all of the major ports in the world, and then capture daily the cargo fixes at the Baltic Exchange. These were fixes between buyer and seller of grain or what have you. Bring this all together, match the cargo to the ship, to the port, and that was the need. There was no reason to have a Baltic Exchange after that. There was some resistance in the city, but it was a great success. And in fact, we installed a large RCA 7000 machine in LiveStream. We didn't have any random access memory on that machine, so it took rather long to go through the millions of records when we were seeking to fix. Now, we sensed even in those days a need for programmers. People like BP and BA, IBM, GEC, Plessey were all looking with staff with any know-how. In the meantime, we both left ICT to go with the machine. That's what happened in those days. If you sold a machine to a customer, quite a lot of the people which helped to create that sale went with the machine. And we went to a company that was formed called ISIS, Information Shipping Information Services in the city. And the shareholders were the Financial Times, Rockness, Dean Shipping, British and Commonwealth, and the Royal Bank of Scotland. And we went there to do the Lloyd's project, and we had a Greek managing director. It grew to 150 people. It had the machine in a window in Lime Street, and every lunchtime there was a crowd outside just looking at this huge machine, and we were strutting inside, not doing much. Eventually that system was sold to John I. Jacobs in the city and still runs today on faster machines. We then left ISIS, Jim and I, to form a company called Contract Programmers Limited. And almost at the end of the time when we had to sign the documentation, we thought it sounded not too good a name, so we changed it to Systems Programming Limited. And we borrowed £200 from Barclays Bank in Wembley because we had been approached to do some work. London University's 1301 team had gone on strike. The entire team had gone on strike, and they were 8 weeks away from the GCE worldwide examinations. And those examinations were marked on the 1301 using MarkSense cards. Now, the manager of the university team approached us and said, "Can you help?" Of course, we said, "No problem." That's where it started. And hired Ken Barnes from ICT. He had written the tape assembly system for the 1301. And Martin Hall from ICT, who knew all about the 1301 programming language, and especially the drum. And then we hired John Porter from Leo, because he understood flowcharts and had commercial applications experience. Now, their first month's salaries drained our capital completely. In fact, Jim and I drew those salaries for the first 9 months of the company's history. He managed by selling 5 second-hand cars, and I sold life assurance for the Sun Life of Canada, did rather well. The days were long, but selling life assurance teaches you how to overcome objections. We of course knew when the university paid their bills, and I regularly arrived half an hour before the office opened each payday and carried a cheque straight to Wembley. We charged £125 per week per programmer, worked all day and all night for 8 weeks, punched cards all over the lounge floor, bullied our way onto the machine at night for testing, rented a second-hand sorter from ICT, and delivered a working system 3 days later. It worked for 4 years without a hitch. Not complicated stuff, but like a first baby, very nerve-wracking. All this proved too much for Jim, and he left and joined McKinsey's. He sold his shares to Ken and paid for them over 3 years. And Ken and I then ran the company, hired David Rodway, also from ICT, and talked ICL by now into giving us the contract to write the 1301-1900 simulator to enable their 1301 customers to move to the new series. Now this contract was a fixed price contract for £26,000, an amazing coup. And it had to achieve a 1-to-1 performance ratio. No problem, he told Peter Hunt of ICL, who had unfortunately hit on the idea of holding back 25% of the contract until it worked to his satisfaction. We asked him to define his satisfaction, and he asked us to draft it. So we resolved that issue. Our delicately balanced financial state compelled us to suggest that he would retain, that since he would retain 25% until the end, he should give us 25% up front, to which he astonishingly agreed. The fool, we shouted after leaving his office with the cheque and going to our favourite restaurant for a celebratory lunch, Schmidt's in Charlotte Street, home of all the ex-Nazis in London, where you were told what to eat, paid the waiter in cash before the meal, enabling him to negotiate a price for the food in the kitchen. But it was cheap. Ken and David Rodway and his team, we were now 25 people, delivered it on time and it worked. Magic, said Peter Hunt, and gave us the 1500-1900 simulator to write, plus another contract to build a series of utilities for the 1900. Back to Schmidt's. At this time, we were now Super League players in the summer of 1965. We possessed a telex which sat next to Ruth in the front of our two-room office in Newman Street. Ruth is a story, a legend by herself, and inspired us to work all day and night. We had two Australian girls who worked part-time as fashion models. They were amazing programs. They worked part-time in an Oxford Street store to earn more money and were given the latest miniskirts to wear as prizes. Our customer visits to the office soared. They thought they were coming to see the PDPA, the latest mini. Anyway, one day in late 1965, the telex chattered and a hilarious message in fractured English proposed that we should go to Ivrea in Italy, near Turin, to visit Olivetti to see whether we could help them with their IBM-based production control system. No problem, we telex back. Ken screaming it was a hoax and reminding me that we had no IBM programmers. Cal had more, in fact. And I said I would go and bring back a £50,000 contract, and that his job was to find 3 top-class IBMers, probably those who knew the 7090 beast, which Olivetti had. Olivetti had found us in the telephone book. I arrived in Ivrea and was met by a driver with a long black car in a long black coat. He was picking me up as arranged, but also someone from Germany. In due course, a tall man arrived in a long black coat with a black hat and a black briefcase. In the car, as we left the airport, I said, "My name is Alan Benjamin, I'm in the programming business." Secure, he said, "My name is Herr H.J. Klausner, and I am a world expert." They were the last words he spoke to me. It occurred to me that I had been kidnapped. The Bond films at their height was relieved to arrive. At Olivetti, I met Professor Leonardo Cantoni, now unhappily deceased, who ran Olivetti's IT. He was a full-time maths professor at Milan University and also ran a restaurant. We met at 12 o'clock. "Come, we go to lunch," he said. An hour's journey into the Aosta Mountains brought us to his mother's restaurant. We finished lunch at 5:30 p.m. He said, "Why don't you start next week? I will confirm an initial consultancy assignment for 3 people for 6 months and say £50,000. Is that satisfactory?" "Okay," I said, "could we start a week later? We were a little busy." So he agreed. I flew home contemplating another celebration at Schmidt's and said to Ken, "Here's the £50,000 contract, where are the people?" "Tony," he shouted, "could you pop in?" In walked Tony Wilson, recruited from IBM, a young analyst who Ken had enticed out of IBM, a rare event in those days. And a week later, he had flown to Ivrea. I have to tell you that 32 years later, he's still there. Since 1987, he's worked for Olivetti and will retire this year. But until then, he was consulting for what was SPL, which became merged eventually into EDS and disappeared. Proved a very large, very successful contract, and we built a considerable IBM mainframe capability on that. At about the same time, we won a contract with Invergordon Distillers, who had bought a 1301. It was run by a young Scot, Matthew Aird, and we sent our man, John Durham, there to write some inventory control programs. It fell to me to manage it, and I was inducted in the normal way through a whisky tasting at 800 hours on a Monday morning. It only lasted half an hour, but I couldn't start work until Tuesday. In those days, one flew on a BEA Viscount to Inverness Airport, where, as the plane approached, the airport manager would drive down the runway firing a shotgun to clear away the birds. It was probably the world's first outsourcing contract, although I think Ross Perot was dallying in Dallas with some outsourcing contracts in those days. We eventually hired Matthew and his staff and rented the machine from ICL and charged the Dingwall local authority for a complete service. This was real responsibility, and I commuted for nearly a year. However, the installation had to be moved. We knew an architect, Bernard Lamb, who had just come back from Japan, where he had spent time on a Churchill Foundation scholarship. We asked him to design and build a new computer centre in Inverness, which he did. It looks like a Japanese pagoda. It's built from natural Scottish timbers, and his lighting comprised Japanese styled mini bulbs hanging down about 4 feet from the ceiling. The building was financed on the strength of the contract and a co-guarantee from Invergordon Distillers. We reckoned if it failed, we could open a Japanese restaurant. Unfortunately, Bernard's knowledge of the Inverness rainfall intensity was sparse, and when it rained, the water flowed happily down the lights onto the computer. We had several days out. However, it and John Durham are still there. And so if you find yourselves up in Inverness, go into the industrial park, and if you see a sort of dark, timbered, Japanese-looking building, that's it. Now, at this stage, our turnover was running at about £750,000 per annum, and suddenly we needed an organisational structure, job titles, memos. Until then, we had done two things well: believed implacably that we could do what we said, and manage the cash tightly. We were a cash and projects company. By then, we had Keith Davis aboard, and he was a marketeer, so we produced our first brochure. It was called 1st of July 1967 at SBL. It was a snapshot of people doing things with great success. We also saw the potential of real-time systems and attracted Peter Adams and Rod Wild away from British Airways. All hell broke loose. BA complained that they had left carrying secrets and threatened to sue us. The trade press went into 2-inch headlines, and the key result of all this was that dozens of real-time programmers applied to us for jobs. An unexpected benefit derived from this hoo-ha. We were moving into new premises in Alfred Place near Tottenham Court Road. The landlords read the press comment and said that we were clearly a company of the future, and they would now not require our personal guarantees on the lease. At that stage, Ken, David and I had guaranteed everything personally, even the electricity supply. It was the only way. Banks in those days risked nothing. So some things don't change. Keith then won a marvellous contract to build systems for the Middle East Airlines. No one believed he would get it. The signed contract arrived, the letter of credit was established, and 2 days before we started, the Israelis blew the airport apart. You lose some and you win some. Alfred Place didn't last long. We burst out of it in 18 months and went looking for premises again. At the beginning of '66, another ICL customer, Stockholms and Schildenbank, purchased a 1301 and was attempting to install a real-time banking system. Now that 1301 was a really good machine, and it went to some really good customers in those days. We'd supplied them with a couple of programmers through ICL who were already in Stockholm generating good fees. But we had to invent things like leases for flats, overseas expense rates, wife and partner visits, and what to do with people when they came back. The bank eventually contracted all the systems and programming work out, and our team grew to 25 people. We opened a Stockholm office and sent Mike Lyons to run it. This was a new experience, someone working and not earning fees. It was called overhead. But it was vital, and the Swedish company became our top profit earner. Work spread to Finland for banks with long, vowel-free, unpronounceable names, and to Denmark for SAS, where we eventually fielded a 20-man COBOL team. The advantage we had was that everything was in English. British and we were not American. Ken and I by now were selling and managing more than programming, and we realised that this size business could not exist on £6,000 capital. We had shared one office between us for 4 years, and this was to continue for a further 6 years, and knew that we needed a better financial base. Salary pressure and inflation were increasing, so we brought in RPI-related price increases to our charging system, and in addition, by the end of the 1960s, fixed price contracts were looming as users struggled to gain control of costs, and some aspects of application development were stabilising. In '67, Ken and I decided to go to the US to see what was what. And I can remember that the 10-day trip cost us all up £500, and we rather cheekily decided to visit the Gulf Oil headquarters in Philadelphia. All the large US companies in Britain had told us that their purchasing decisions were made in the US. We got into Gulf because of our accents, and met the manager for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, that crazy grouping of territories which I think still persists today. We persuaded him that we could staff his COBOL developments around Europe. There were 4 centres in London, Copenhagen, Amsterdam and Milan, with a consistent set of standards for programming and report generation. He agreed, and a month later we won our largest contract ever with John Rosier, eventually leading a pan-European team of over 70 people. COBOL training was at night after work, and no one complained. The final straw which made us move to new offices in Grosvenor Street was recruiting an old, i.e. 45 years old, but brilliant Fortran programmer called Derek Abrahams, who in turn began our first graduate intake program of 6 young people to do work in a new field, in numerical machine tool programming and mathematical model building. One of them, Frank Pott, is Professor of Computing at Aberystwyth today, and another, Graham Webster, was until recently head of IT at Teesside University. This was a new development at SBL and required a new organisation, new selling methods, and new identity. This we sought to build at the new offices we found in Grosvenor Street, but we decided we needed better class accommodation, and once again employed Bernard Lamb, our architect, to design it. This time, inspired by the new Scandinavian furniture fashion, he produced offices which were magnificent, in a building where we had only 2 years to run on the lease, at £2 a square foot. So we decided to raise some capital, and we found a small merchant bank called Moseley & Company, run by an amusing lawyer called Brian Samuelson. They agreed to buy 20% of our equity and provide loan guarantees. They also placed the now deceased Paul Seacart, a very famous MC, on our board. Board meetings ran to 10 and 12 hours after that. Walking into our new offices a short time after we completed the deal, he saw the new decor and shouted, "We're ruined." Now, 2 things shone during this fast growth, no rules, risk-laden era. The first was the incredible hard work everyone did, which accompanied the confidence bred from not knowing we could not fly. The second was the unique trust which pervaded the relationship between Ken and David and me, and the constant victory of do over don't. I'll stop here at the beginning of the 1970s, just before a new and very different era emerged. That was our beginning. Thank you.
It's exactly what I was told last Chairman Bush. Now, I've got to do a rebadge. I can see the chap advancing practically.
Sorry.
Right, will somebody run watch our hands on me? So, I haven't even opened the thing. Right, I stack out next to me called Gibbons. And I'm here to talk about CAP. Probably slightly differently to Alan, because there was an awful lot of clag at the beginning of CAP when getting it started, which there didn't seem to be with SBL. They just got together and started SBL. CAP was a bit longer in gestation than that. It started really in 1957 in the offices of a firm of chartered accountants called Hayes, Akers and Hayes. It's now called Hayes Allen. They've been our auditors for 26 years. They did much better out of us forming a company than they ever did having us as partners or anything like that. And it started in 57 because that was the year that Alex Dagobert came and joined, having failed his finals and done his national service, and come back to finish off. And I'd been there for a year, age 22, and I was flogging through the paperwork necessary for my intermediate chartered accountancy exams. Alex passed his finals in 58, was put in junior charge of the audit of Harrods, where I spent happy hours in the stockroom playing Charpentny, and Harrods had a few punch card machines. So how to audit these? And funny enough, the partners at Hayes got hold of that very quickly indeed. And they said, yes, you better go and find out something about punch card machines and the computer things. So we set up a systems department in Hayes, which exactly 4 of us, and Alex and I went on a programming course on the Stantec Zebra at STC in Newport in 1959. And what a machine that was. The best computer ever designed. It's very like my first girlfriend. You know, the first girlfriend was always the most beautiful, the most desirable, the most unattainable. The Zebra was it for me, and I thought it was a marvellous machine. And so did several people sitting in the audience, I have to say. I was not thinking that I was going to have anything to do with computing at all. But my great-grandfather is William P. Hartley of the Jam fame, and I was always going to be the chartered accountant company secretary of William P. Hartley's Jam. And they were taken over by Cadbury's right in the middle of the programming course. So I looked rather desperately at Alex and said, I suppose I'll better be a programmer then. He said, well, I don't know if you're good enough, but you might as well try. So that's that. So I love programming. I'm absolutely terrible at it. I do remember 2 programs I wrote. One was for composing Palestrina-type music. A man called J.J. Flux wrote a treatise in 1725 called Gradus ad Parnassum, which is all the rules of how to compose music by Palestrina. It's a programming manual for Palestrina. So I programmed this, and it ran for 45 minutes on the most powerful machine we had, and it produced 2 C major chords. Which technically obeyed the rules, but I don't know if you can say the stick out. Very similarly, a bit later on, I think the last programming thing I did under the BDI of John McLeod was I wrote a thing to schedule cement lorries around London from a central base. And that ran for 45 minutes, and as a result of it, 2 cement lorries turned up together at midday at the same place. That was it. I was kind of pissed off at that. John said, you've got something wrong in the loop there. He said, you literally said there. And instantly it ran for 12 minutes instead of 45. I realised I wasn't a programmer by then, but I loved it from the beginning. Alex didn't program. Alex was more, what can you do with computers? What can we make them do? We sold STC on the idea that they needed a commercial language. COBOL 58 was about the only commercial language around then. And we called it SEAL, the Standard Electronic Accounting Language. It had keywords in it like debit and credit. And after all, we were accountants. We knew what these things mean. It's extremely difficult to write a compiler that understands debit and credit. Don't even try. And I don't think anybody's done it yet. So it means different things in different contexts. But anyway, we said we'd do that. It got so complicated, this compiler, that in the end we said, no, look, we better go and design another machine to run it. So we designed a machine called the TF1.1 with the help of a chap called Roy Francis, who was the chief designer at STC. And then, just as we were going to build this damn thing, we were going to run this brilliant compiler on it. Harold Janine of IGT went around the planet stopping every single magic computer effort. Do you remember that, 61? And suddenly there wasn't a computer anymore. That was it. Well, not knowing much about things didn't help, didn't keep us back from leaping into print. I'm particularly proud to see Ewart Willie in the audience. But I intend to quote from something of his. Sorry about this, Ewart, you didn't know this was going to happen. We published a work in the Annual Review of Automatic Programming. Dick Goodman, remember that? In Vol 2, there was a thing here called A Critical Discussion of COBOL, written by the BCS Discussion Group 5 on Advanced Program, chaired by Mr. Willie. It had in it people like Pat Shackleton, Peter Hunt, John Hall, Sandy Fraser, Sandy Cormack, and Alex and I. On the first page, this is the introduction, it says, the committee at its inception considered that COBOL was the most advanced form of automatic programming, very decent of us, for business purposes so far produced. It greatly appreciated the free publication that had been made of the details of the language and felt that this provided a timely aid and stimulus to the development of the subject generally. However, it is now believed that a suitable form of common language has not been arrived. On page 4, the editor said, the British Computer Society wished to make clear that views expressed in this report are not necessarily those of the society. And the final thing, that I got it out of the library and it's damn obsolete. same book, the next page, if you like, next article, was a thing called The Growth of Commercial Programming Language by a gentleman called Harry Becker, who was the architect, really, of SEAL. He was at Standard Telephones. It's all about how you write a commercial programming language. So in writing this compiler, this SEAL compiler, we met lots of other compiler writers in other fields. I mean, it was a tiny, tiny field. Not many people around were writing compilers. Then we met people like one of the ones we met was Fraser Duncan of English Electric. In kids group, remember Duncan, Huxtable, Hawkins, Randall, Russell, all that lot that came out of the English Electric compiler group, if you like. We met Fraser, and we said to them in English Electric, what you need is a commercial language. I said, what? He said, yes, we know all about commercial language. We've written this critical place on COBOL, we've written a SEAL compiler, which just unfortunately didn't have a chance of running, we know all about it. And they said, yes, fine, write a language called Talk, the automatic language for kids code. I couldn't possibly have called it that, I don't know. And Fraser Duncan's boss, Cliff Robinson, agreed and asked what name he should put on the contract. And Hayes flinched. Accountants don't write compilers. Accountants don't even know what compilers are. So they said, either you chaps are good boys and you come back and you're good little accountants, or we will lend you 750 quid and an Algol typewriter to get started. So we were lent 750 quid and an Algol typewriter and we got started. Then we had to think of a name. But it's rather like Steve Jobs saying, if anybody can think of a better name than Macintosh by lunchtime, I'll have it, but otherwise it's called Macintosh. We said, what about computer analysts and programs? And that's a terrible name. Ah, dear, oh dear. We got the lunch and that was the only thing we thought of. So computer analysts and programs it was. May the 3rd, 1962. On the first day of CAP, there were three of us. There was Alex Dagobert, Harry Becker and me. May 62 was a big month for me. There was CAP. My first daughter was born on the 18th. And I passed my accountancy finals on the 25th. I don't want another month like that. It's bad. So we fixed this name, we went for lunch, and we walked out the front door, and there was a bloody great lorry. And on the side of it, it had CAP. And it stood for Company of Argentine Meat Packers. To this day, you can go to Sainsbury's and get a chicken saying oven-ready chicken from Cap House. But we said, to hell with it. It took us all morning to pick the name, so we weren't going to change that. So we did all the good things about early software houses. We moved our overdraft, which everybody did in those days. I think Al moved his overdraft once or twice. And it was very useful having English Electric as a client. Banks in those days said, and who do you work for? And if you're a consultancy firm, who are your references? And English Electric was a jolly good one. And so we moved our overdraft. And the story is, I'm not sure this is true, this might be slightly fictitious, but the story is we badgered the yellow pages into starting a new section called Software Houses, and we were the only one in it. I don't know if that was true, but it's a jolly good story. I asked all the speakers today, have a word about ethos and competition and things. Ethos in CAP was a pretty odd one. We were, after all, accountants. We'd been through accountancy. And both Alex and I came from public schools, Malvern and Winchester. And so we were sort of male professionals like this, rather on the lines of GCHQ in the war, which is essentially a male preserve. You didn't get many girls at GCHQ in those days, probably still don't, as far as I know. But certainly it was a male preserve, all that sort of thing. And the fact that we were doing something quite astonishingly technical rather phased everybody. They said, what do you know about your accountants, your public school boys? What do you know about computing? Which is lots and lots with our referencing here. You and Willie, stuff like that. But we were sufficiently noisy and enthusiastic to attract Chris Strachey to be one of our first outside directors. And he was great. I can't actually remember what he did for us much. He fogged me on Church's Lambda notation. I do remember that. Him and who was the other guy you worked with? Paul Landon. Peter Landon, sorry. And I couldn't understand Church's Lambda notation to this day, but never mind. And he was the guy who said to me the thing that has stuck in my mind forever. He said, you'll never have a problem with space and speed because the technology will solve that. He said, never. But I never want to see you ever write a go-to in any of your programs here. I said, what? That's a simple way of writing programs. No, he said, never write a go-to. That's the thing that's going to trip up your programming. He said, don't worry about space, don't worry about speed. There'll be megabytes available, well, mega words. In due course, and there'll be ships that go very fast, and so he didn't actually see that far ahead, but he knew that it was going to get faster and faster and cheaper and cheaper. And he was right. But from the accountancy background, we did learn two very important things about running a company. One was charging by the hour. You had to charge by the hour. What we charged by the hour was ridiculous. It was something like a couple of quid. But still, we charge by the hour, and every week, every month, Alex would look at the bill and say, oh no, we did more than that, add another 100 quid. You got better value than that. And we also learned, which is fairly unique, I think CAP is fairly unique, this idea of a profit unit. You made a profit in a year, and you chopped off a third of it. You said, we're going to distribute this among the lads. And the lads were given profit units, rather like sort of shares, and you had so much per profit unit. And then if you had 10, well, you got 10 times the unit value. If you had 100, you had 100 times. Alex tended to have a few more than the rest of us, but never mind about that. It was quite a good system, and it worked for a very long time. And it was well known to be one of the better methods of remunerating people. It also put a rigid hierarchy into the company. People who were on profit units and people who weren't. And that was not such a brilliant idea either. However, we got over that. Okay, so our first job was the compiler for English Electric, the Talk compiler. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. It was paper tape. Assembling the compiler, if you understand what I mean by that, was 10 rolls of tape this size. And you used to start it running, you'd go off in the car to Crew Station Buffet, which was opened at about 4 a.m. You'd have a large fry-up and you'd come back and just about compile the compiler with anything like assembly. And it got bigger and bigger in the sense of the number of passes it had to go through. And every pass had to be written by somebody different. So John McLeod and Don Hunter and Rosemary, all sitting up there, were given a pass to write. And they wrote phase C and phase D and phase E and phase F, and Alex had a go at writing phase D and got it wrong. Gave it back to Don, who wrote it properly. Wrote phase D. Were you to phase D, Don? No, it was Rosemary. It was phase D. It was Rosemary. Oh dear. She's turning for the outfits. I've got to be careful. But as a result, we had on board these excellent little workers, and of course they finished their bits of the compiler at different times. And so John, I think, was the one who finished his first, and he said, now what are you going to do? And Alex said, why don't you go and get a job? You know, you're from IBM, you know what jobs are like. Why don't you go and get one? All right, said John, I haven't got one. He got us a contract for a stockbroking suite for Phillips and Drew on an IBM 1440. And that lasted on and off for something like 15 years. You've got to remember what the policy of manufacturers was in those days. You probably all know all about this. What they said to you essentially is, here's the computer. Now go away and hire yourself 4 programmers and get on with it. We have enough problems writing our own software, thank you. It was basically the attitude they had. They'd done the machine on the luckless customer. Luckless customer had to find something to program it. What a gorgeous opportunity for software houses. You only have to have one IBM programmer, like John did, and you can say, we know all about IBM programming. What? They said you've got IBM programmers far higher? Come around, sign a contract. And as Alan said, we probably had most of the IBM programmers in the early days, but it wasn't for long. They started moving around a bit. Competition. One of the things I was worried about when we set up the show is that we were all going to talk anti-competitively against each other. You know, oh, we beat SPL in this contract, we beat Hoskins in that contract. In fact, I don't know what the others are going to say, but we hardly ever met each other competitively. There wasn't often that we quoted against each other. Certainly in the early and middle 60s. Everybody had their patch, they were all doing their own thing, and they were all motoring down that patch. I mean, SPL were abroad ages before we were. Still, you know, so they were concentrating on abroad. So we didn't get much competition. We did, however, like the idea of international. Now, one of the things about Alex was he was the worst French speaker I ever met in my entire life. His dad was brilliant languages. He wrote the book on codes and ciphers before the war. He spoke 7 languages fluently and several more afterwards. And Alex couldn't put 2 words of French together. And I remember once we had a 1972 dinner, our 10th anniversary in the Institute of Chartered Accountants, with Stephen Spain, DTI, and he was a chap from Clontarf in those days. Some name like O'Dran, some name like that. Can't remember, a little dark fellow. Anyway, they're all up at the top, and we said to Alex, you've got to say something in French, you've got to. So he said, all right. Maynard Donker and I wrote it out for him. He read it out. He couldn't believe it. It couldn't be Swahili. So he said, no. We write it out for you phonetically. So he wrote it out phonetically. The Shah sat on the mat, sort of thing. You know, and he read it out and it sounded like Swahili. So in the end we said, well, how would you like it? And he said, write it out as it was originally. So we read it out in the real French. It was a paragraph, I suppose about 5 lines. And he stood up at the big dinner in the Institute of Chartered Accountants and he taught Swahili for a minute. And we said, what was that? What did he say? And they suddenly realised, the Frenchman realised he was trying to speak French, so he leapt in and rescued him. But that put Alex off the idea of the continent. I think he should like that. I loved it. I liked the continent. I liked languages. And the opportunity came in '64 when a gentleman called Isaac Auerbach, remember Ike Auerbach, was going around trying to buy up the entire UK software industry. And we said no. He gave us a very big dinner before we said no, which is great. It wasn't Schmitz, I can't remember where it was. And we said no. And he said, that's funny, your sister company in France did just the same. And we said, yes, well, of course they would. How's he talking about a sister company in France? So we tore off the French directorate. There was a CAP in France, Centre d'Analyse de Programmation, started in '61, a programming shop. It just happened to be called CAP. So we rang them up, and we had lunch at Mirabelle, to a d'argent. This went on for this went on for about a year. We said, no, we can't come on doing this. We really have got to stop. We better do something. And they said, well, why don't we set up CAP Europe? Because CAP France had a nice little bloke called Philippe Song who didn't know what to do, so they said, go and run Belgium. So he went and set up an office in Belgium with one programme, and that's called CAP Belgique. We had a bit of trouble with Dutch CAP. We had to make sure we call it CAP on. We just be careful about that. And anyway, it took us 2 years to get it all together, and we set up CAP Europe, who sent out smart-looking brochures like that. Ta-da! Is that impressive? It's even got pictures in the back of people like Hardcastle. My lecture does not stretch to cover you, please. So we had a press conference in Paris. Unfortunately, the day before the press conference, I had stayed on the top of the Eiffel Tower. I'd been there for about a week. And so I missed the whole thing because I was curled up like a fetus in the hotel room and died. But apparently it went very well. He got going really quickly. We appointed Philip Dreyfus as the PDG in 1968. And that's, we sowed the downfall in that because we gave him some stock. Never say, parents 50% each, give the managing director 10%. Because he's got you by the curlies. I reckon. He's got you by the curlies. And that's what eventually happened in 1975 when Kampf came along, took over CAP France, bought Dreyfus out, and I had a full 3 minutes in a hotel in Heathrow selling after CAP Europe for £750,000.
Our first year, I did say something about turnover. Our first year's turnover was
£16,000. We made a profit of £95. We had 5 people at the end of the year. Wow, so pleased I got raised, but all stats from the back. 67, 4 years later, we had a turnover of £184,000. Oh, no, it was a profit of £18,000 and 86 people, of which one was a graduate, trained raw from university. And that's the moment we started realising that graduates being taken straight from university and trained were one of the best investments you could make in the future. And as I also asked the boys to say, where are we now? Well, of course, it doesn't CAP anymore, it's SEMA. And last time I looked, 1996, their turnover was 926 million, their profit was 50 million, and they had about 9,000 people. And I'm very glad about it because that's not what we're trying to start. Thank you very much. All right, next in the alphabetical order is Sir John Hoskins of John Hoskins & Co Limited, as it was once upon a time. But you need with microphone, sir.
Thanks so much, Barney. I view it as a little bit like a sort of collection of war criminals who've been living under assumed names for about 30 years, being gathered together to face their first interrogation. And so we say, well, it was all a very long time ago, and we probably have quite a lot to answer for. We always hope. However, I hope that some ancient witness will come forward to say, well, I remember John Hoskins from those days, and yes, he did get mixed up in writing autocoder for IBM 650s, but all I can say is he was a very polite young man and very good with animals and small children. In those days, software really was, we thought we were being terribly witty when we used the word software as a play on the words. And it wasn't until around 1969 that the inverted commas came off the word and we began to see the word being used seriously in prospectuses on Wall Street. I first got involved in the computer industry when I joined IBM in 1957, and I just have a few memories of that time. One of them was, I think, being put in charge of sorting 240,000 IBM cards in some sort of market survey for British Rail at the Wigmore Street Service Bureau. And it was almost impossible to know where to put the cards, and every wall was covered with boxes of these cards. And at about sort of 3 in the morning, you'd suddenly, one of us would turn to the other and say, hang on, was it a traffic jam I reached? By traffic jam. 17 columns we sorted on, that's all I remember. A little bit later, I found myself in charge of the airline sector as far as IBM UK was concerned. And that was interesting, BOAC, BEA mainly, a little bit of Pan-American business. Some extraordinary activities we got involved with. I know there was a machine, some of you may remember, called a 305 Ramac, which was about roughly the size of a sort of substantial garden shed. It was one of the first disk machines. It had disks about that in diameter, and it had total capacity of about 5 million characters on this huge stack of disks. Very expensive. They had special floor loading requirements. And on that we managed to get it to sort of do 2 dummy seat reservations for KLM under protest by having about 8 people working 48 hours a day, so to speak, for about a week. It was
A rather different world. About 1963, I was asked whether I could go on the board of BOAC, which seemed rather an interesting thing to do, because at that age, I was about 35, I think, they flattery offer. They were just getting into the IT field in a big way, and I'd been looking after their account, and I was going to be called Chief of Information Handling. So I thought about that a little bit. What actually made me decide to leave IBM was something much more fortunate, really, and that was I had a blazing row with my boss, and resigned the next day in a sort of emotional state, and that was the best thing I ever did, really. I then decided not to go to BOAC, but to start a business. And I think, like most of your speakers here, and I think probably most of us in the room, we had that feeling about the industry at that time. There were the big accountants and the big consultancy companies were all moving in, and they didn't really know anything about it at all. The manufacturers, as Barney says, just handed you the black box and said, get on with it. And consulting, advice, and expertise was really non-existent. And it was, I think it was then that I first heard the phrase, the blind leading the deaf. That's the sound, the way it operated. So I had this idea of a business. I had financing by luck through contact with a company called Burfield, which was an engineering company which eventually became part of GKN, and probably the most profitable part of GKN. Very far-sighted man called Herbert Hill, who was chairman. And I looked around for the first person to bring onto my team, and that was somebody called John Pierce, who some of you will know. He and I had met working in World Trade headquarters in IBM in New York during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For some odd reason, that happened at the same time. And we both had a great deal of fun, I remember, challenging the IBM's of cultural norms, because at that time it was very much a sort of short bag and sides and white shirts only. And he wore very long hair, and I wore suede shoes and striped shirts. And that was a dangerous thing to do, and you could feel a sort of frisson go through every IBM office we ever went into. These two people who were clearly sexually dubious, politically unreliable, came into the room. We then brought on board Alistair Watfield, who was also an IBM, I think, a man with a first-class engineering degree, and a rather eccentric sort of Baron Munchausen Swiss uncle of the Swiss-French family. And the Baron de Watfield was always contacting me, I remember, with ideas for wonderful business activities on the continent. And all I remember was going to Paris with Alistair, taking his uncle out to the Tour d'Argent, somewhere like that. We had no money, and it practically bust the company. We had a fantastic dinner, and then we never heard from him again. That was the end of that. We had Mike Jackson, a very clever software man who'd, I think, first did grades at Oxford, then went to Cambridge and disgraced himself by only getting a second in maths. Then started business. We named the company after my name. I have to say that we decided, we probably don't all the same as Barney did, that we didn't really want to have a play on computer buzzwords. I think there's also a great attraction in naming it after an individual, and that is that you can then sort of move into chicken farming if the software doesn't work out, provided the articles are right. And mind you, it's also dangerous. I digress a little bit. If you remember, this was a time of sort of charlatanry in a very big way in the consulting industry. There was a wonderful consulting company called Prendergast Haddon Hurst. And you must agree, those are names which fill you with comfort. Dealing with sort of old-fashioned English professional gentlemen. And none of these three individuals actually existed. But I talked once to somebody who had worked in that firm. And he said, well, of course, the problem really was, we were recruiting very fast to handle all the business. We seemed to be so good at selling. And then, of course, people would leave because they were no good. So the real training, I said, what's the training to give your people? And he said, well, the training we really had to give them was to how to answer the question which was bound to come up after they'd been working as a client for about a week. And that was, how long have you been with Prendergast Haddon Hurst? And the correct way of dealing with that was a faraway look came into your eye. And you looked out of the window and you said, sometimes it seems like 20 years, sometimes it just seems like last Monday. We have somebody present in the audience, Ray Harston, our first finance director, who had fought a losing battle, really, to sort of bring the hubris in the technical area that people like John Pierce and I always felt. I mean, anything that anybody thought of, we immediately assumed we could do. For example, the chairman of Burfield said, we really ought to have a real-time system for the London Stock Exchange, and we said, yes, I think that we can do that for you. And we set up a thing called Centerfile. I thought of the name. It came in a flash of inspiration. I'm not quite sure why, when I was sitting in my bath. And I noticed that when I paid my fees as a director of Burton Group now, the payslip is processed apparently by Centerfile, so it still exists. It was part of NatWest at one time. That was an extraordinary project. It gave us an opportunity to play around with something called OS 360, the first operating system on 360. We had to try and run it as a real-time system. It was an interesting formative experience. I don't know if we ever made any money. It made us a certain amount of money because we were paid on fees. But there were other things of that kind. We actually invented word processing, but realized when we actually worked it out that it would take one IBM 7074, which I think in money of those days cost about $750,000, and would just about handle 6 typists. That is, if handling 6 typists is the expression one really ought to use. We had a company motto which was unofficial: arrogance in victory, malevolence in defeat. Our first job was for a Burfield company, which was helpful. We've got to start somewhere. At the point at which I think we really felt we were getting off the runway and becoming airborne, aptly enough, was when we were called in to advise Rolls-Royce Aero Engine Division, which had an enormously complex business, complex product, and an enormously complex manufacturing control system called Magpie. It was an inappropriate name, but still. And sitting there in the office of the person who's running that, I had one of my first experiences of the hazards of being a consultant. When my eye fell idly on a piece of paper on the desk, and I thought it was a memo about something rather than I just glanced at it, and I suddenly realized it was a highly confidential document saying that Pratt & Whitney were beginning to gear up to take over the market completely, that the RB 211 was costing far too much, and basically the bottom line was that Rolls-Royce was going bust rather rapidly. need hardly say I did not deal in shares that day. I did tell John Pierce about it, but I didn't tell anybody else. And the Heath government bailed out Rolls-Royce about 9 months later. We went through one or two different stages, really. We started out as a consultancy. We then came to the conclusion it was just almost impossible to get enough good people to build a serious business, and we were very interested in building a serious business. Then we went into software products, and we learned the hard way that fancy software products for software people was just too difficult to sell, because good software people want to invent their own toolkit, and they're not really interested in other people's. We did some training. We went into training, that was well successful. And we also eventually began to build application systems, and that was really where we began to get the sort of leverage we were looking for. We were also, of course, at about that time, struck by the first recession. That was about 1971, I think. And we went through the formative experience of pledging our personal assets, our houses and everything else we owned for the privilege of continuing to trade. And we were saved in the event by a contract, not quite as simple as that, but I think it's very nearly, when we got a contract with the Home Office to do the Police National Computer Unit at Hendon. And that was big business, huge business for us at that time, and quite a turning point for the company. The only thing I can really remember about it now was that when the system was on test, one of the staff from the Home Office, sitting at the control panel, accessed the file for missing and wanted persons, which you will immediately realize is more or less one and the same file, although the distinction between the two is a subtle one. And he thought, well, he might just enter his own name for fun, see what happened. So he entered his name, keyed it in, pressed the enter button. The machine groaned, the tapes were, the discs rotated, and after about a minute, flashing lights appeared on the screens, sirens began to sound, and uniformed police entered the room, took this man by the scruff of the neck and took him out of the room, and never saw him again. It's obviously a pretty good system. That's really, I've been so terrified by Barney over the time scale. I hope I'm all right for time. I'm going to finish really in 2 minutes. I began being obsessed by problem solving. I began in the early 70s to get rather interested in the UK economic problem. And the long and short of that was I decided that I had to go and do something different. And we sold the company to Martin Marietta, at that time our biggest American customer. Now, of course, one half of Lockheed Martin. And I can't remember now what the turnover of the company was at that time, but Ray Harson probably tells. I think in today's money it was probably 12 or 15 million.
3 million then.
3 million at that time. About 12 probably. The Hoskins Group retained its ethos, I think, and retained its people. And it's interesting, that's what all the other speakers say. It's amazing how certain people just stayed in place and built this business, or these businesses and the industry, from these very small beginnings. We had, as far as I can remember, and Ray, you can correct me, virtually no external funding from the time that Martin Marietta bought the company, right through to the end of the story as far as I'm concerned now. The company went through various quite demanding stages because it was owned by different businesses then. Martin Marietta decided to get out of the IT industry as such and just concentrate on its defense industry, which was probably the right thing to do. And they sold it to Plessey. Plessey became, of course, part of GEC. I was actually asked to become chairman in the mid-80s, or mid-late 80s, when it was the company was just about to go public, under Martin Marietta, when it was still owned by Martin Marietta. Sadly, I couldn't do that because I was at the Institute of Directors, and I just felt it was a slightly exposed position for me to go and do it. It was a great pity. It then went from Plessy thus into GEC, and GEC put it on Weinstock, sold it to Capgemini for, I think I'm right in saying, about 380 million. Is that right? I have to say, I think that was what you might call a top 8 price. But very fine business. That's really what I was.
George, is it normal to take a break like that? I think the next speaker would like a break. It's the point I'm making. Yes, we'd like a break. Just 5 minutes comfort break, so to speak, before the next speaker again. All right? Everybody settled? Sit down. Sit down. Rest of the cat. All right. Brown notes, as it says in the program. The other brown notes.
The other branch, one with the two pair. I suppose it would be down the years one of my worst nightmares to follow any one of the three previous. To follow all three of them, as you can see, it used to tremor and panic. However, I do have my technological crutch, and I think I can perhaps provide a buffer between quality and then Taylor, which will get the easiest mine. I haven't actually prepared anything about myself, but everyone else has, so I might as well say. I stumbled into information technology, but it wasn't called that then. Because when I came out of Cambridge, I went to what is now part of the Foreign Office, and in those days was the Commonwealth Office. And it was interesting, and I learned some tricks, but it was terribly boring. In my last summer, the only summer, I used to spend an hour watching the rehearsing of Trooping of the Colour to postpone the business of getting to work, so I got about 11. I used to take 2 hours for lunch.
And sneak away about 6, which is the acceptable time. And so I thought I'd better do something, and my
Why don't you become a consultant? So I went on to see Early Hall, who won at that time the firm of consultants, I think probably. And I was interviewed by this charming old gentleman with white moustache, who said something that clearly nobody has said to consultants in the last 10 years, which was, wouldn't it be a good idea to do some managing before you would lie as managers? An idea which struck me at the time with some force. And I said, what do you suggest I do? He said, well, why don't you go and join one of these newfangled computer companies? He said, IBM looking for people, Barrows looking for people. And the upshot was I joined Barrows. And I spent 10 very happy years there. And one of the things that distinguishes me from all the previous speakers, certainly from them, I think, is that I have written a program, I'll say something about that later. But I am by no stretch of the imagination a technician. And anyway, I went to Paris and sold accounting systems on those marvellous devices, 3,000 moving parts in a box, 18 inches by 18 inches by 9 inches, which mostly worked. But after about 9 years of this, I just remarried this very pretty Irish girl, from some of you may remember, who was talking about 10 sons. And since I was certainly aware that I was going to be an enthusiastic participant in this process, and the first one was already on its way, it seemed to me it might be a good idea, because I didn't think I was really going to make progress in Barrows. I don't know why, but I didn't. And I was doing all right. I thought I'd better start a business. And I remember sitting outside Lambeth Palace on my way into work in the car, which told me how long ago it was, 1963, thinking to myself, what can I start? And I thought, I know, a computer bureau. And of course, many people, including one who only the Monday before last, accused me of being an imposter in this session on the grounds that all I'd ever known was a computer bureau. That was my first idea, a computer bureau. so CMG had its genesis sitting outside Lambeth Palace in the morning sunlight, worrying about how they were going to provide for these 10 sons. It only turned out to be 3 and a girl, but it went at quite a pace for the time. And so there I was. I'd never actually at that stage seen a computer. I was very obligingly sent me on a course on the B200 immediately after I decided to do this. And I wrote some assembler, something about HP source, as I recall. It never worked, of course. But I was very struck with the B200 as a card handling machine. And that was, so I thought that's what I'll do. So I'll now go into the technological prop, without which I cannot remember what I wish to say, which I hope will turn out to be a real technological prop. Yeah. The first thing we did, the first thing I did was think to myself, well, I don't know anything about computers, so it would be a good idea if I had somebody who did. And I was working in a team at Lloyds Bank at that time. I was a non-computer person, and there was what was then known as a systems engineer called Douglas Gorman, with whom I had some acquaintance, and by whom I was very impressed. So I approached Doug, who had just resigned to join Coopers, working at Demonstrations. And I remember standing in sunlight in Brokeback Street and saying, I've got this idea, what do you think? So he said, looking at me seriously, he said, what we need is a real salesman. So we looked around, and I had another friend called Collins, Bob Collins, and there you have CMG, Collins and Gorman. Unfortunately, Bob, like Alan Spratt, opted out at a very early stage. That's just a slight problem. And so we invented Computer Management Group. At the time we invented Computer Management Group, there were 8 of us, I think, in a basement in Greenwich. But it sounded good, and it stood the test of time, of course. Because that slide is actually a current CMG slide, which I borrowed for this purpose. And the logo, which we designed in 1964, has not changed in the period. And then this is where the technology, we have to see if the technology works as well. Doesn't work that way, so I have to look at the machine. Now, if we look at the origins of the company, and one of the features here doesn't show on my screen towards that screen, so we first of all, we bootstrapped it. CMG had no capital to start with, and in the whole of its life to today, to the best of my knowledge and belief, has never had an overdraft and has never had any outside money. It was entirely bootstrapped. So that was principle one. Because at that time, we didn't have the faintest idea how you would set about getting money. And that didn't happen. Douglas Gorman had an almost religious prejudice against the whole idea of overdraft or borrowing. The second problem was that you needed a computer to run a bureau. And that was one of the few original ideas we had, but you didn't have to have a computer to run a bureau, you just had to have computer time. And we tried very hard to persuade various customers to let us buy time on their B200s, and they couldn't. And the only one we could find to use was an H200, Honeywell 200, which at that time was just coming in as a competitor to a 1401. And the third idea we had was that we produce a package, a complete package. And the amusing thing is, given the fact the first 2 speakers are both accountants, was that it was a package for accountants. It was actually called ACT, which caused us endless trouble later. It stood for Accountant's Computer Time Letter. But I'm inclined to think, and I'd be glad to know if it's true or not, that it was probably the first full-scale package in the UK. It ran on Bureau, and it was, from the user's point of view, absolutely complete. Right down to the fact that there was a draft memo for a start on the introduction of computing. And we sold it on a bureau basis to accountants. And I still have a vivid memory of the child who went above, who was the cause of all this, in his mother's arms at the front door of our little house in Putney, and this senior partner of a firm of accountants' wife, with 2 children in hand, walking up the path with the nylon bag to and fro in the post from the accountants and to us and back again. And nobody seemed to mind. Partners would bring up and they'd say, never mind, Mr. Miller, I can hear the baby crying. I'll hang on while you sort her out. Which again is part of the trust which existed in those days. However, we started with this because, I mean, at the beginning we had this vision of ourselves swinging hammocks in Barbados in about 5 minutes flat. But of course it didn't like that, as we all know. And somebody came along, I think it was Cooper, somebody in Cooper's actually, and said, have you got a programmer who could go up to ONO in Liverpool and do a job up there? And we had acquired a third guy called Bob Fawcett. And we said to Bob, would you go up to Liverpool and work at ONO? And after a lot of thought, this was 1964, 5, we decided we would charge £80 a day for him, £10 an hour. Extremely good money. So, in a sense, that was our first step in kind of being a full service company. I have a rather coarse expression for the ladies will forgive me, which is that service companies are poor as they do what you pay them for. And that was what CMG did in this respect. The other idea we had, which we got from Cooper's, was that we bill fortnightly as we went along, which was one of the reasons why we never had no card. We also started taking on fixed price jobs. And we gave a fixed price, but it was fixed price on a time and materials basis up to that fixed price. So we billed fortnightly all through the life of the job. So we used to hire people on Monday, send them out to work on Tuesday, bill them the Friday week, and pay them the subsequent Friday fortnight, which did wonders for the cash flow. We went into, I actually got home. We went into employee shareholding very early. But we went into it, I think, on the basis that nobody else quite went into it. We said, yes, you can have shares, but you have to pay what we think is the market price for them. And at the time, we were so convinced that we'd be trampled to death in the rush, and the people with rich armed lords would buy the company, that we put rationing on it. We said you can't pay more than 10% of your salary to buy shares at the time. But in fact, of course, we weren't trampled to death in the rush, although normally we had about a third of the employees owning shares in the company at any one time. But that developed into a full-scale system in which we were actually, we used 2 merchant banks to manage the company and our auditors. Several probably in the room. And we leased everything in sight. One of the reasons why we didn't have an overdraft. I was at that time distantly related to the Bernsteins, and we persuaded their leasing subsidiary Black Arrow, first of all to lease us a typewriter. Then we persuaded them that they should lease us desks. And then we persuaded them, and this really was a breakthrough, they should lease us an entire computer room. And they said, but if we have to reclaim it, what will the use of partitions be? And we said, think of it as an oil rig. It's rather the same. So they thought of it as an oil rig, and lent us the money. And finally, and this is the one technological advance for which I'm going to claim credit, we went over to COBOL in '66, which enabled us to, in fact, undercut in-house operations' own estimates of their costs. We could charge our selling price and do the work in COBOL. It nearly cost me my life, because the way it worked was this. One of our chums, and I'll come back to the question of chums in a moment, one of our chums came along and said, could we do a thing called an air index, which somebody, two people struck calls, which was a business of sorting out who flew from where by which route. And all the tickets in the world, quite effectively, were analysed by this company in order to see traffic through gateways and so on. And it was fundamentally a punch card job. So I said to my technical colleagues, I tell you what, lads, we can do this with punch cards. But what I need is punch card images. There's a piece of software under that called TabSim, which enables you to make an H200 work like a tabulator. So you write me rest all your back. The nights I spent in Honeywell, Brentford, covering holes in punch cards with bits of tin foil, so I made a hole that shouldn't be there. However, the point was that my friend said, look, we'll do Cullimore because you're sticking your neck out, we're sticking our neck out, but really Cullimore were actually the semblance of the real programming. But to be fair, they whizzed through the work and we just went into Cullimore. Mind you, the Air Index was still in use 20 years later on Thameslink, which is really amazing if you think about it. Now, Barney said, say why you think we won. And I'm going to start with luck and networking. There was a Honeywell 200, which was just getting into the 1401 competition. There was Jim Donaldson, who many will know here, but I don't see him here, who introduced us to British Relay Wireless, a name that people may remember, a very early cable company. And they had a Honeywell 200, and they wanted some work done. And after a bit, Jim said, I tell you what, if you made them an offer, they'd let you use half their computer and their computer room. And that was our first real office. Up to then, we'd been in the basement in Doug's house in Blackheath. Admittedly, a basement decorated to proper CMG standards, that is to say, walls were whitewashed. It had blue hoided felt on the floor, and we sat on orange, hilly, static chairs. And every CMG office, certainly until I left in 1981, was decorated like that everywhere. 70 of them. Thirdly, rank zeros came along, and they wanted high all the time. And we went from having a few hours on the machine to having 200 or 1200 going full tilt in about a year. Oh, no, and I mentioned. Now, that makes it sound as if it was pure, but in fact, the loot was all coming in from writing applications programs. A commercial union, for example, were particularly charming. They used to write our fortnightly check fortnightly for us and send it down by hand to our Croydon offices, God bless them. And we did a number of interesting things. There was a thing like the Air Index called the Medical Index, which where the same company had hundreds of nurses reading doctors' prescriptions, thinking that was a job, and converting them into punch cards, and then analysing the prescribing patterns for the pharmaceutical companies. They publish reports. They still exist, I imagine. They live in a rather charming Queen Anne House, just in the corner of the Common by Hampton Court. But we were lucky in our networking. That's IMS and Air Index. And then our biggest stroke of luck was that some chums in Reader's Digest said, would you like to do a job for us in Holland? And we sent a couple of guys to Holland to do this job. This was 68. And after a bit, they said, yeah, this is a pretty good market here. We can do something here. So we set them up to do something. I said they had to share a flat. We gave them a flat each and then a flat for an office. We found that in Holland you could mail shot in English, the software, and we mail shot it. And we got quite a business on it. I remember that we had a Yorkshire lad called Startle, one of the only 128 startups in the world. And he went to call on Shell, and the guy in Shell said, startup? He said, that's a funny name. Peter Bristle. He said, hey, what's that then? So the guy said, Mouswinkle. Which is slightly funny that it sounds, it means mouse shop. But the result was that we recruited some excellent Dutchmen, one of whom is now the chairman of CMG, Cornelius Josephus Maria Struthen, and whom I will remember at the age of 23, saying to me as I left, Pip, Pip, old fruit, give my regards to Piccadilly. But he's a very good man. But we were very lucky in that time. It was the best thing we did. CMG is now something like 2/3 Dutch turnover. And of course, just said the chairman is Dutchman, chief executive is Dutchman. But this was the real key. CMG was a people business, and we involved the people. I hope somebody's giving out of time for that, because I'm worried. This was the real key. It's a people business. You put the troops out there on the ground, and you're entirely dependent on their writing good codes. Both, all my previous speakers have said, working their little hearts out for you, and you want them involved. When we started with recruitment, I don't know any other company today that does this. If you were going to join CMG as a secretary, your first interviewer was a secretary. If you were going to join as a punch operator, your first interviewer was a punch operator. If that person approved you, process 6,000 application forms. But any doubt out. So you started with your peers. John said, arrogant in victory, malice in defeat. We had a saying, it said social equality, functional hierarchy, which meant we didn't have to listen to my stories in the pub. We were one of the early open plan office people. I'm now working in a company where I have a private office for the first time in my life. Nobody in CMG ever had a private office. Nobody had the Daily Mirror ran an article on us because none of the directors had car parking slots. They couldn't understand. First come, first served. Like Barney said, he had a distinction between people who got profit share and people who didn't. We had a very abrupt distinction between managers and non-managers. It was the difference between being commissioned and the other rank.
Not socially, but functionally. And pay-wise. No matter how high you paid you were, you could reckon that if you got promoted to the first level of management, you have something like a 33 to 30% or 50% increase in pay. Right. They were highly paid and they had a profit or profit margin. We tried to be fair. We demoted people who failed, we didn't fire them. On stage, someone got re-promoted. Payroll by law was on the corner of the accountant's table. Self-files were open.
And we spent a lot of time developing a consensual framework and principle. Every company had a meeting at which everything was discussed every month. Every quarter we got the entire management together for 3 days. Senior management people did like that. We had interlinked multinational committees. And all the training was done by the board. We didn't do technical training. You were told to read a manual. All the training was company cultural training. It was all done by the board. You came in and we drew together a group of you who were by definition mixed nationality and mixed jobs. You never got all programmers or all system analysts. The groups were selected and you spent 2 days with at least 3 members of the board. And if you didn't come under their culture, you never would. And you sometimes did. I spent, along with the rest of the board, 2 days of every week in a subsidiary company. So there were 17 companies around there. And then I spent 2 days every week, 3 times a year, 51 trips. We did all the management training ourselves. And we had a management methodology with specialised teams, Australian unit size. That was interesting. We found that 80 was the unit size. Above 80, they made lots of money, and after a bit, they were. First time it happened, we got an accident. Second time it happened, we thought this is a rule. The third time it happened in Holland, because they wouldn't believe us that it was a rule. And after that, it was a rule. Modular structure, very flat management structure. We ran joint management teams, as Barney said, Albert Costello's everywhere. I am, of course, the front man. Doug Gorman was the back man. And we gave lots of people leadership opportunities. We had detailed and very conservative accounting. We wrote everything off. We did forecasting from about month 1. And we had ruthless cash management. And we found we were multinational. All companies were equal in the sight of God or group, it didn't matter which. Most American and English companies, most companies, tend to run their overseas subsidiaries on a mother company and colonies basis. And not unnaturally, the colonies resent it. And whilst they may not have the Boston Tea Party, it's all there in embryo. We tried very hard. When Holland grew, which was quite quickly, I had a desk in London and a desk in Holland. Whether it was meetings with the group realisation course, booze, not sort of some God-forsaken reason, we went to both Scotland and Holland when we hadn't exploited our own backyard. Holland worked, Scotland never did. It's a foreign country. It's more foreign than Holland. Except that Belgium is more foreign still. God, Belgium. 6 months, and it cost us 50,000 quid each to get rid of our first 2 useless Belgians. I'm trying to make Belgian jokes. My own personal memoir, which was my last invented package before I decided I wasn't up to it, which was a marvellous hand-built dinosaur of a terminal-based batch processing package just at the time when interactivity became really serious. There are disadvantages to not being interested in technology. But the outcome is 32 years of growth. Every year CMP has grown. No year has it not posted a profit. It's still independent. It's still largely owned by employees and ex-employees, even though it's quoted. It's worth, by the way, today, I know this figure, it's quite heartfelt since I don't have any of it. It's worth just under £1 billion on the stock exchange. It's genuinely multinational. And I have to say, it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Great manager to work for.
I don't blush, I haven't got the skin colour.
Just a minute, who else is here?
Then you got our 20 minutes.
I have to say I was completely thrown by your opening remarks, Barney. When my old colleague and friend Philip and I were in our more conceited moods, we used to compare notes on our double act, and although we saw ourselves as Lennon and McCartney, Home Drozor, never as Abbott and Costello. I have to say, though, for those who don't know the difference, that I was the guy with the black suit and was bald. Philip was the good-looking boyish one with the white suits. So the roles that we played, although we usually agreed on what we wanted out of things, I would go into the meeting scowling, banging the table. He would wave his arms about and smile, and it would confuse the people on the other side of the table so much they would give us what it was we'd already agreed we wanted. So it worked really well. But thank you anyway, Barney, for the analogy. My talk is primarily about Psychon, which I did not found during the early 60s. And although Logica did not arrive until 1969, I will spend some time on talking about the formation of Logica, since I was one of the founders of that. Psychon, or CIR, stands for Corporation for Economic and Industrial Research, as originally called, was established in 1960 as a UK subsidiary of a US professional services company. It was probably the first UK company to call itself a software house. Now, I had thought at this moment in my notes that Barney might in fact make the claim for CAP as being the first company, but in fact he didn't. He said 1962. So I was about to say that we were probably the first UK company to call itself a software house, didn't employ these starchy guys with pinstripe suits who did all this boring work on accounting compilers. But he didn't say that, so I won't. I joined at the beginning of 1961 for two reasons. First, they were offering very high salaries. They cheerfully met what I thought was an outrageous demand of £1,350 per annum. And second, two of the principals, and indeed my interviewers, were two eminent mathematical academics, Professor Maurice Kendall and Professor Sandy Douglas. And since I saw myself then as a bit of a maths whiz, I reasoned that a company such a flash an intellectual sounding name, and with such worthy directors, would probably provide me with the sort of work I wanted, and clearly other people did as well. This assessment proved substantially correct, in that the culture and work style of CIR, and eventually Logica, was very much directly and indirectly influenced by the early interest and skills of Morris and Sandy. Philip Hughes joined about the same time. Our first office was above its backness in Kingsway, and we then progressed to renting space from IBM at their bureau in Newman Street. Our business was software problem solving for profit, and I emphasise the word profit. You remember that we were a subsidiary of a US active company at the time. We were very, very profit oriented. Yet because there was absolutely no experience anywhere of software writing as a business, it was a baptism of fire for all of us, and indeed, sadly, for some of our clients. For example, on my first day, I was thrown a Fortran manual, a new language for me, and a file containing a complex specification for a Rolls-Royce jet nozzle design, involving the solution of sets of hyperbolic differential equations. I never saw a contract, or indeed knew whether there was one, or whether or not I made or lost money on the job. I fear, and I suspect, the latter. CIR, thank goodness Sandy Douglas was my first boss not in the audience, I won't have to change the script slightly. CIR shot everything the software jungle moved, and we very often missed. We developed high-volume, low-value commercial products. They became obsolete, even before they were completed. We lost money. To this day, I've always been prejudiced against products as a way of making money. I know I'm out of date, but that's the way it was. We sold bureau services. We lost money. I've always retained similar prejudices against bureau. And indeed, perhaps that's one reason why Logica was last to enter the big world of facilities management. We tried selling training. It was blind leading the blind. We lost money. We tried management consultancy. I don't think we lost money, but we didn't make any either. We bought a company specialising in engineering consultancy. Although we lost money, we at least had the consolation of picking up one or two very good staff, including our late-to-be chief executive, Jim Brennan. Although we were pushed in on the deep end on most activities, we didn't mind, since we possessed naive overconfidence that comes with youth. Even now I wince how I think when I got myself into the office of a hard-bitten industrialist and explained to him how we could optimise his decision-making by reducing it to mathematics and sticking it on a computer. Many sadly believed our overzealous or even innocent say, and regrettably there are many companies who got their hands badly burnt on their first experience of computing. Although overall we had a good technical team among the staff, some oddballs did exist. At one extreme was the academic purist, who could never grab the idea that he was working in a real commercial world. He would intensely dislike the nature of discussing the cost of what he was doing on the grounds it was beneath his intellect to do so. He was always dreaming up new and ever more beautiful ways of doing things without ever actually doing any of them. At the other extreme, sadly, we had a few deadheads, none I'm sure recruited by Sandy. One such was a senior colleague of mine charged with studying critical path analysis methods. His favourite line, because I worked with him on sales for a while, was telling the client the computer worked, quote, almost at the speed of light, and therefore he'd be assured of a speedy solution. One day he called me into his office and asked me to give him what I thought was the average cost of writing a program. When I said I thought that was a tough one, he accused me of being a typically precise and pedantic mathematician. So to make him happy, I said £1,000. I'll talk about any program, I said, not a particular program. From then on, every time he saw a client, he said the computer worked almost at the speed of light and he would do the job for £1,000. Fortunately, he never sold anything. Despite all this, the work ethic was amazing. We'd never worked so hard in our lives, before or indeed since. Most of our work was in Fortran or COBOL, on the IBM 7090 Bureau in Newman Street. This to us was the ultimate in high-speed machines. It performed, if my memory is correct, and it may not be, 32,000 floating point multiplications a second, had 32K of RAM, and cost, again, if my memory is correct, £300 an hour to use. We spent a lot of money on using this machine on program development and execution. Today, in real terms, of course, it'd be cheap to buy a PC, run our program, and then put the PC in the dustbin, and do the same thing all over again next time. We would load our programs, consisting of a stack of cards, onto the 7090 via an IBM 1401 slave machine, which would then in turn print the output. Because of queuing problems on both machines, we would get 2 runs a day, maybe 3 if we were lucky. Half the time, the program would be rejected by the compiler for trivial reasons like a comma or a bracket missing. So back to the end of the queue again. We found a way to speed up development was to work a full day, sink a few pints in the evening, and then go back to the computer when it was quieter, chat up the operators, and get some more runs before midnight, and then maybe finish off the night with a bottle or 2 of Retsina and some Kleftico in Charlotte Street. Quite how we survived, and why we enjoyed it, I really don't know. Certainly for the wives, it was a miserable period. But there were shining, glorious exceptions within this apparent frenetic anarchy. I can unreservedly and seriously assert there was one area in which we really excelled. This was large-scale, one-off, complex scientific problem-solving for large, sophisticated, high-budget clients. In particular, for the oil industry, the scientific service, and for defence contractors. At that time, CIR had little or no competition for doing such work. Within the whole spectrum of mathematical modelling, simulation, weapons design, etc., I would have to single out the use of the technique of linear programming. This is the maximising a linear function where the variable is subject to linear constraints. We had in Professor Martin Beale, arguably the world's leading practitioner on the subject, and probably the most brilliant applied mathematician I've ever worked with, and we achieved enormous success. Indeed, Richard Petroleum spent so much money with us in this area that they decided to buy the UK company from its parent. The name was changed to the dreadful name of Scientific Control Systems and eventually abbreviated to SICON. Then followed an uneasy relationship with BP during which the seeds of Logica were formed. On the upside, staff morale was high. We were doing good work. North Soho, with its convenient location, great ambience, and many restaurants, was a good place for recruitment and retention of staff, and the management, of which Philip and I were now part, highly autonomous and well paid. As I recall, in the late 60s, Philip and I were both paid about £7,000 per annum, a lot of money in those days. We were all becoming older and wiser, as were our clients, and our selling and business practices more effective. We were also starting to make money on the commercial, as well as the scientific side. But what about the downside of our relationship with BP? I have to say, a large operating company owning a software house simply does not work. We're effectively running a company in which we had no stake. The BP in-house computing and OR departments did not like our charge-out rates and wanted the option to give their business elsewhere. We, in turn, did not like being constrained over our markets, told we were overpaid, and reminded that Cyclone and its profits were trivial compared with BP. I can recall no positive communication whatsoever between us and BP during this period. So inevitably, we did start to ask ourselves the question, what the hell are we doing all this for? The nature of the war stories swapped by the management of the pub after work changed from bragging about our own sales successes and moaning about our project prices to discussing the ownership of the company. We flirted with but rejected the idea of an MBO on the basis that software companies weren't very big in the city then. In any event, BP would probably not sell it at a reasonable price. In particular, Philip and I compared notes in some detail, and having worked fairly closely for years, we knew we were pretty complementary in our strengths and weaknesses, and felt we could go off and do our own thing and make a pretty good double act in the future. We didn't know it was going to go out of the start. We therefore decided it was time for a change. Our potential breakaway group got expanded to 5, and we duly did what everyone looking for money does. We wrote a business plan. Now, this business plan was like any other we've ever drawn up. It promised high profits, it promised excellence, and it was heavy on the fashionable and glamorous buzz phrases of the day. These at the time, I'm now talking about late 60s, were operational research, mathematical modelling, real-time systems, turnkey systems, mini-computers, and communications. But if I temporarily jump ahead a year or two, it did amazingly deliver on its apparently arrogant promises. So it turned out that our sales propaganda was to some extent justified. Anyhow, we're back to the 60s. We took our business plan to the city looking for a meagre risk capital of £50,000 to start the company. To our intense disappointment, instead of seeing that our CVs looked good, that we were throwing out very good jobs and pensions, and that Philip and I were prepared to work for half salary, they nitpicked at the small print and insisted we put in significant cash of our own. Since we all had big mortgages and kids at school, this was not on. So reluctantly, we turned to the US. Along came Planning Research Corporation, PRC, a publicly quoted professional services company, who cheerfully coughed up $100,000 for a minority equity stake. They were later very well rewarded over their trust when they sold out to EDB for a huge return on their investment, and good luck to them. So in March 1969, Philip and I resigned from SciComm, and April the 1st, Logica started. Dear old Maurice Kendall wished me well, but the well-meant kindly advised that without BP, we could not possibly succeed, but there'd always be a job for me if I returned. Our first office was still in the living room in Camden Town. To our delight and astonishment, and I'm sure to the bemusement of our perceived competitors in the late 60s, our press release and interviews produced enthusiastic reviews in both the national and technical press. Thank you, Chris Edwell, etc., etc., etc. And everybody liked the name Logica. In fact, I might say that perhaps inventing the name Logica was probably my biggest contribution during that time. What does the name mean? It doesn't really mean anything. It just sort of, the word A sounds vaguely Latin and intellectual, and logic is a good buzzword. And it translates internationally, and it sounded good, and it was good. I remember dear old Barney coming up to me, probably at a pub, saying, bloody name Logica, it's pretty good. I've been trying to forget it, but I can't. So I knew it. Also our delight and surprise, many highly respected ex-colleagues and their friends were phoning in, inquiring about jobs, and companies were phoning wanting to talk to us. The honour of the first applicant went to a shy young analyst who I always rated very highly, both before and since. His name is David Mann. The honour of the first client went to Ian Barron of CTL, who knew Philip and who phoned on the first day to give us a small job. Our first big break came curiously not from our advertised line of high-tech business, but from on-site Cobalt body shopping. When we, I think, as many as 7 strong, we secured a contract with ICL to provide 12 programs for 2 years to work on the driver and vehicle licensing system at Swansea. I said, no problem, so we got them hidden coverage and have them next week. We picked up some programs who were being laid off by British Steel South Wales at the time, and away we went. So you can imagine what this did to our projected cash flow and our confidence to expand and invest. From then on, it was success followed by success in both sales and projects, and in technical and financial terms. I guess there might have been a reason for this. Clearly, as with all successful companies, sheer luck played a part, and maybe we had more than our share of luck. But I guess, without wanting to sound too immodest, we must have had some little talent in management. And without a doubt, we did manage to attract some top-class people at all levels. Important, though, was the fact we'd all started our careers in this business, the technical coalface, and had experienced, and indeed made, every mistake known to man. So we felt we knew what we were doing. And partly because of this, is your computer going?
Yes, it's
Okay. Partly because of this, and partly because of our own personal styles, a distinct Logica culture did flourish, having its roots in the early SEER culture. We did not attempt to define exactly what this culture was at the time, other than observe that we were all enjoying ourselves and that we were attracting a certain Logica type. It's probably true that a potential recruit had a better chance of admission if he was an Oxford science graduate who could discuss Fermat's last theorem whilst drinking a pint of real ale through a mouthful of chicken vindaloo. If he wore a flowery tie, maybe that also helped. But it was not until the cult textbook on successful companies by Waterman and Peters, In Search of Excellence, came out many years later, we actually read what we'd been doing without explicitly analysing it at the time. I'll now leave Logica in the early 70s on a high note before I have to admit mistakes we made later. In fact, I will admit one, which John was giving me a cue for. The first job, and I do mean the first job, that we seriously put a lot of work in and lost was the Home Office PNC. Along came these people at Hoskins and won the bloody thing. They must have been on the inside track somehow. And I believe our bid was a much, much better bid. So that's a tremendous time. I did have Barney. Okay, well, I finished with Logica, but I just wanted to conclude with one or two remarks for change. These are just a few unashamedly subjective memories of the early days of CEIR. I guess I feel as if I'm a member of a panel of Call My Bluff, where 4 people have to give a version of the early days, and you have to guess which is the true one. Certainly, I don't think whatever we say is contradicted too much. As far as the day is concerned, although I still see software services as a relatively new industry, it is, of course, as a sobering thought, 40 years old. Many of our old colleagues, ambitious pioneers of the old days, are no longer with us now. And, equally sobering, is the fact that many of today's software leaders and millionaires weren't even born then, in the days that seem like yesterday to us. Software houses, they're called still called software houses, have of course positively and massively improved since my day. Due to improved technology, staff infinitely more productive, business practices, procedures are more tuned up, and companies contain many fine but strange new jobs, such as corporate image coordinator or human resources director. I've got UG written in my notes on human resources director, but I can't think why. I can't think why, but I won't amplify that. Selling seems to be a doddle these days, simply because there are vast amounts of business around. Although admittedly, recruitment and retention of great staff seems to be a, if not the, major threat to companies. Staff seem to work a lot fewer hours, and indeed earn a lot more in real terms, and that surely is good. I feel I was very lucky to have entered the industry when I did, but despite the enormous strides since then, I just cannot believe it's as much fun today as it was then. And that's always been important to me, so I have to say I don't have any major regrets about not doing the business now, so that seems a good time to sit down. Thank you very much.
But you probably picked quite a few yourselves. I think probably the sensible thing to do is if I can have the speakers up here. What I'll do is let Brian. Not this one, don't worry. The other one. A real big chair.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was a fascinating afternoon, which tells you something about the software industry, at least as it was, and I suspect as it still is. Questions for our panel? Who would like to start?
Well, my question can be answered very quickly with a yes or a no. But first of all, might I set the scene? Imagine I was your fairy godmother and could put you back to the age of 30, but you have the vast experience that you have now. Would you take the same steps as you did then now? Stop on the right or the what?
I don't think so. I don't think so. It's a different world now. It really is. And what Len said right at the very end was, I think it was less complicated 30 years ago.
Different or better?
Different. Smaller, probably just as intellectually challenging, but smaller and less players than the whole thing. Now I think you would have to take account of technology that's come in the last 30 years and so on, and you probably start differently. You probably start thinking about money to begin yourself with. Very noticeable that nobody here asked for huge sums of money to get themselves off the ground. They all worked in garages like you look back up, or in dungeons or basements or something. I think now if you were going to start anything, and you said to your bank, I'm doing it from a basement in Wimbledon, he'd never talk to you. Anyway, it's not with me. What would you do?
I'd bank a cheque before doing anything as a fairy godmother, because I think one of the great differences between now and then is there's a much greater willingness to invest in what is now an ordinary industry. I may surprise you, but it's ordinary in the sense of being well known, well understood, better understood. So if I was 30 and you came along as a fairy godmother and offered a large sum of money, I might not go into software. My disposition might be to find something that wasn't being done.
I'll comment in a slight way, I think with Fairy Godwilds, starting companies and being 30, one has got to feel that personally confident that one can see the next few years at any rate. We felt it at the time, that we may have been cockiness, it may have been arrogance, but we felt confident that we knew a bit about things, that we could see the next few years. Now today, I'm too old, but I damn if I can see the next few years in this business. I really, I would have no idea what I would want, advising people what to put their money in. Products, I say I've admitted to a bias on product, because companies that started off with a services background at least didn't have the right ethos. Products, we had no idea how to make products. What John said was absolutely right. The people we employed wanted to invent things. It was far more important if they did something new and exotic rather than raise money on some boring old product that somebody else had invented. So I would have to duck the question really by saying, for the next few years, I haven't a clue what it was.
Starting again, I think I'd make 2 points, and they connect with things already been said. I have rather the same feeling that Alan has about doing something in a different field, actually doing something much simpler. I think the thing we really learnt about was business during the course of our experience. And looking back, one realizes that the software industry was had an incredibly voracious appetite for talent, clever people. And if you like, that actually was the scarcest resource, much scarcer than money. And the return on brain power, the return on good people's time was relatively low. And therefore, without being over cynical about it, I sometimes think, goodness, couldn't we have done well if we'd made concrete door lintels instead, but just done it very, very well, because we had enough good people to do that. I can't actually say that I got terribly excited about concrete door lintels, but it's a possibility. I think the other thing really is the importance of money. I mean, none of us, we at that time, we were operating in an economy which was incredibly unmoney conscious. I don't mean that in a sort of value-laden way. What I mean is, you remember once the GC actually introduced British industry practically to the concept of cash flow, something which I know when I first had dealings with Rolls-Royce Area Engine Division was almost unknown. Most companies generated no cash, reported reasonable profits, went to the bank to borrow the money to pay the dividends, and then hoped that they somehow get through the following year. That was partly because of the state of the economy and partly because of the lack of sophistication. When we went in, I touched on the word hubris, I think, when I was talking. We simply thought that we could do virtually anything. We had tremendous energy, we had far too much confidence, and we assumed that in the end, if we did these things as cleverly as we thought we would, we'd make money. Money would be a sort of automatic byproduct. We didn't really have to actually focus on doing that, otherwise we would fail to make the numbers add up. I remember when Ray Hudson, sitting at the bank, became our finance director, he told me a few minutes ago, he said the first 2 years in the company, he really felt he was wondering what on earth he was meant to be doing. And it was only, he introduced us really to the idea of a very novel concept of cash in must exceed cash out. We brushed that aside as a petty bourgeois convention. People with our sort of talent really didn't need to waste our time with. And it was only when we came fairly close to the brink in the 71 that suddenly everyone was looking towards Ray and saying, have we got it right? What do the numbers say? And so on. We were learning very densely. I think one third point too, I think we were all incredibly lucky. If you look back, I'm sure there were lots and lots, I'm not just saying this to be sort of pious, but there must have been lots and lots of talented teams of people around who just were sufficiently unlucky not to get their business off the ground. Entrepreneurship is a terrific gamble. So it's a combination of getting just enough things right and a bit of luck as well. But, yeah, I
I think, like Alan, I'm not sure I'd go into software. And like John, one of the things that struck me very forcibly, because in my checkered career, once I left CFG, I have, amongst other things, been, for example, deputy managing director of a bakery. And I'm currently part owner of a cake factory. Never wants some cakes. I think the really striking thing, and the thing that has made this industry such a pleasure to be, and made me feel I'm so lucky to be, is, as John said, we have commanded this enormous brain power. We've always been surrounded by very clever people. When you go and look at other businesses, which both you and I certainly have done, one of the things that strikes you is that really the brain power, I mean, this may sound, I may remain arrogant even in semi-victory, but the fact is that the brain power is pathetic, and the ability to organise ideas that programming and systems analysis taught us is just so wildly lacking. I mean, otherwise not introduced so much. So my feeling was that if somebody came to me with a federal government, like Alan, first of all I'd back the check, then I'd sit down and have a damn good think. The only trouble is you're asking me to imagine me at the age of 30. One of the things that I don't think any of us is terribly good at the age of 30 is sitting down and having a damn good think. about that kind of issue. Damn good think about a programming problem or a sales problem. So my uneasy feeling is that I would probably accept the grandmother with the fairy godmother's thing. If I've got all the experience and sit down and have a damn good think, and I'd probably decide to be a Jane Austen hero and live as a rentier.
If I could add just one tiny thing, Brian. Serge Kampf is probably the most successful software company runner.
Yes.
In Southern Europe. He said to me once, and I remember being utterly horrified by it, he said, I love doing business. I said, what do you mean? You don't know anything about software. And he said, I don't care what the business is, I love doing it. It can be shoes, it can be software, I don't care which it is, I love doing business. And that's probably part of the secret of his success. The business came first. What the business was just a set of parameters which you had to optimize.
But is that really true in this sense, that you have all commented on the relative ease with which you were able to recruit high quality people, or maybe you had to have very strict controls, but you could attract them. And if you've been making the concrete beams or even the cakes, surely you wouldn't have been able to. Wasn't it really that what you were doing at the time was the thing that would attract the high quality people, and that it was quite difficult, I think, in that generation to think of things which would have attracted high quality people in the same way?
Being cynical, I think two elements. One was that because we were magicians in the eyes of the public at large, indeed wizards, we could command wizards' fees. And that meant that we could command wizards' salaries, we could pay wizards' salaries. And there's no doubt about it, I'm an economist by training, and people go where the money is. And speaking of cakes, for example, one of the problems is that there isn't the money in cakes that enables you to pay the wizards. Now, whether that's one could, with the aid of your fairy godmother, break out of a vicious circle and produce cakes with such skill and make such margins on it that you could attract federal people. I don't know, what do you think?
I think the point you make is a fair one. I think we were talking about a different type of business in which brain power was one of the real factors of production. The other thing we're talking about, when you talk about lintels, and I mean that's tongue-in-cheek obviously, but a simpler business is where the brain power is in actually thinking about directing, controlling, managing the business. But the business itself isn't dependent. Brain power isn't one of the raw materials on which it depends. I think that's the difference. I don't think it is easy to get good people when we're recruiting. The thing that I found most exhausting really about the first couple of years was the recruitment process. What we said slogan, I said, which is that you to the people who are starting the business with you, we've got to make people who are better than we are, which is, in a sense, you could say, human nature, almost impossible. But we've got to try and do something like that. And if we can get a first 20 or 30 absolutely triple A, then it's an oversimplification, not true, but I believed it at the time. Then nothing can stop us. We will become a significant business. And if we don't do that, we won't get anywhere. And the time we spent, rather like house buying, that's an exhausting business. You take one look at the house, it's not the house you want, but you've nevertheless got to go through the whole process of walking around the garden and admiring the kitchen and having a cup of tea and everything. And that was the process we went through with people. Again, again, and again. I was very interested in Brown's peer group recruiting technique. That's a very interesting idea, which I haven't come up with.
Logico adopted Brown the second. Presumably, general experience at the time put into recruitment was a very good investment. Probably distinguishes this industry from any other industries of the time. Probably no longer true of the high-tech industries. The high-tech industries are not any different. Was it in general?
Well, the only is Logica, I think that it's certainly true. I'm trying to think back as to what my motivation was at the time. At the time, people were joining us because we were telling them that they were going to be doing really clever and advanced work. We were also telling them, and that was true, they were. And so they're the type of person who wants to do that, fresh out of Cambridge with his first, and he wants to do good physics or whatever. We tell him, yes, you've come to the right place. And also, this is, if you like, why Philip and I moved on. Cyclone, we were doing such work there, is that it was new, it was a startup, it was growing, it was an adventure. And that was a terribly big attraction. And last, but certainly not least, we did actually, we had this hard commercial edge, which we learned from CIR. And indeed, we didn't brag about it too much at the time, but we were making about 30% margin on our work there. So we were a fairly hard-nosed commercial outfit, but we were offering miserable salaries, but we were offering shares in this new startup company, which were not worth anything, but they could be worth something one day. And indeed they were. So, but the forces on people, I think, well, first of all, typically the professional people were taking on, was to do this glamorous work. Second, to be in a small, honest company, and by honest I mean everybody related to each other in a perfectly open, honest way and respecting each other. And third, and as a background, feel that they were, to use the fashionable phrase, stakeholders in what they were involved in. And these were certainly forces in people's minds in those days.
I think there's another factor. I agree with the fact about interesting work. I think that was probably the dominating issue for people who wanted to come into this industry. There was an environment. There was Christopher Well and new magazines. There was new commentary. Today in software, the communication around software, television, the internet, the magazines, the number of people in the industry is so different from what it was. The environment in which we work was really quite different in some ways. I wasn't kidding when I mentioned that groups of 30 or 40 people used to stand outside the window in Lime Street and watch this computer and its LANs function for an hour. It was magic, and I think that's gone. So that's why I think with a fairy godmother check at 30, where your energy is higher, I would look for something for the 21st century. What would it be? But it would be, I wasn't in, and I think everybody thinks this, we never sat down to think what we would do if we weren't doing what we were doing, because we were in this completely magical situation.
I don't think that very much though. I mean, one of the interesting things that came out of this morning was the moment when you hit 80. I found that particularly interesting. 80. Because at that moment you start having to have a management structure. It's something to do with that's the optimal size for a house in a public school. management structure, which all of us did differently, I guess. And the second is recruiting becomes more difficult. Because you're not in anything that Ben was talking about, where here's a group of guys in the same room, all of whom know each other, their wives and girlfriends' names, their kids' names, what sort of beer they like. That disappears. And as soon as that disappears, the recruiting is not into such a friendly basis. What we funnily enough, the statistic I read out, was that we were 87 people strong in 1967, and one of those was a raw graduate recruit who'd never done any computing in his life. And we built the cap over the next 10 years on graduate recruitment for people who didn't know anything about computing. And surprisingly enough, mostly arts graduates, not computer science graduates, which I always think very good. The arts faculties at the universities, those are the sort of people who bend down the best. So I think nowadays you've got kids, our kids, probably not all that brilliant on computers, their kids coming through like trains on computers. I think the ability to have to train somebody in the basic operation and the computers seems to me to be disappearing very fast. They're getting trained before they get to employable age. So that has been interesting. But that will change the business completely. And I think the push from underneath saying I want to work in computers will change the shape of what the software industry is now. Could you say your name before you ask a question, please?
Hi, David McGill. Surely the equivalent of your companies nowadays are the small computer games houses. I mean, you just read about them now. I mean, they seem to have the same sort of atmosphere as you had in your area. I mean, it was quite a good article in the paper the weekend about the computer games house that launched Tomb Raider. I mean, it just sounded exactly the same type of situation. Small group of people knowing each other very well. And just putting this game together.
I don't know how they're doing. I think it's an enormous company, because they're working very much on their wits. The next generation, that's what they love doing. They probably don't care too much about the business side.
That's right. Yeah.
That actually may be an interesting change, because one of the things about the 60s were the giant companies, and there is an argument which is interesting. I find it interesting to learning all the rest of the way. And that, in fact, take for example the big firms of accountants and lawyers, they are now unnecessarily big. When you go to them, what you're looking for is one or perhaps two people who will help you with whom chemistry is right. And maybe we're moving towards a world of smaller, rather like that very effective Arthur Anderson poster, which shows all the little fishes forming to form a big ship, which being Arthur Anderson, I take it for granted as a shark. But I think that may be the shape of the world in many ways, and that therefore perhaps we wouldn't grow such big companies. It might turn out, I mean, I don't know how my colleagues find it, but we span off in the 70s at least 4 successful software companies, with people who didn't like our intense contract and formed one of their own contracts.
I think there is a difference with the computer games. The first is that their customer is using their product not for himself. He's distributing it in the main on devices. And secondly, it's global. It genuinely is global. And I think it's quite a different proposition. But there will always be new companies and startups in new things. There always has been in history. But it's just, I think, the difference has been the pace. In the last 30, 40 years, the pace, the quickening of the pace from the early 60s when there were numbers of maybe 8 or 10 companies, we went for a few years. But since the mid-70s, perhaps early 80s, there's been a flood of new activity. The pace is very different.
It was a very interesting example of the size of the company going wrong. There was a chap called John Harwell, I don't know if you remember him. Very good compiler and Jack Harwell. And he totally financed this company at his own pocket. And he said, I will never have a company of more than 30 people. Because if I handle a company, then that's just going to stay at 30. happened, for those of you who used to follow Jack London, you used to get a lot of chiefs bundling up from the Indians, no Indians coming in underneath. There was then a spin-off of about 15 of the 30. And Jack would take a deep sigh of relief and say, good, now we can recruit some more Indians. You have to do that under 30. So, and this cycle lasted till about the late 60s when Jack said that's enough. That is not a way to run a company, you can't do it like that. The whole pressure on us, all of us, I think, was to go on expanding, no matter what. You couldn't stop and say, we're not going to have any more people. Our aim was to expand. You didn't want to, It didn't want to push it.
I mean, I think that's one of the absolute dilemmas, and it's a dilemma in many businesses other than the ones we're familiar with. The analogy I use is flying speed. Unless a company is growing, physically growing at a certain pace, the internal dynamics of the company just don't work. It doesn't attract talent, it can't replace people who fall by the wayside or go off and do something else. And the idea that you could sort of hold it at some optimal size, I didn't know about that particular example Ron has just given us, but it doesn't surprise me in the least. It doesn't work. And I think what you have to do increasingly is find an organizational format and culture, and I think IT actually helps this, makes the sort of mechanics of running a business very different from what it was. The sort of thing that Brown was talking about, which is spinning off other things. I mean, at Hoskins, we had quite a steady outflow of people who, having started hard entrepreneurial business, could become a own business, and then began to get the fever, wanting to do it themselves, and went and did it. We had an unusual approach, perhaps an unusual, I don't know, probably not so unusual now as it was then, which was that if it didn't work out, we were perfectly ready to bring them back. We didn't sort of say, you know, those who are not for us are against us. They said, okay, you had a go, maybe, there are many people at Hoskins who are running businesses of different sizes now, some of them very successfully, and some of them had a go, as I say, a lot of it's luck, came back and then actually flourished in the company again, probably having learned a lot and having got that entrepreneurial niche out of their system. But I think that spinning off and creating the internal organization where you can have a number of businesses, you can satisfy that entrepreneurial drive inside the business is another important way.
And it was obviously a feature of the whole industry through this period. But what about the subsequent period of growth by acquisition itself? I mean, on the whole, I get the impression that we have not been very successful at that change, whereas you can see in Europe, let alone the States, companies which are now monsters in this field do have grown by acquisition rather than by your organic growth process.
Well, the statistics are that, you know, a significant proportion of acquisitions produce less value for shareholders than the original companies separately did. So I don't think we're unusual particularly. I think it may be harder in people business where you haven't got the underlying assets to manage. I mean, one of the people I think is most fascinating to watch is Kevin Lomax with Mises, because when Kevin started Mises, I have to admit that I thought he couldn't possibly win. I thought the Hansonian approach wouldn't work. And I think a lot of us thought that, right? So I can remember drunk one night at the Irish Embassy having a furious argument, very friendly, furious argument with him on stage. The fact is I was wrong, and it has worked so far anyway. It's a very successful, and it's grown entirely by acquisition. I mean, well, I'm sure there has been organic growth of the individual companies, but fundamentally it's been acquisition-driven exercise.
In Logica, our growth was almost entirely organic. We didn't exactly have a policy of making no acquisitions, and looking at 70s now. Because the acquisitions that we did make were on a purely opportunistic basis, rather than being part of a policy that we will grow by acquisition. Indeed, our staff, don't forget, an acquisition very often inhibited the career opportunities of the staff, because you were then picking up talent from another company, depriving somebody else of an opportunity to move into that ground. But the acquisitions that we did make were, in fact, I reckon we had about 60% hit rate of success on them. But they just came along. They weren't part of our, if you like, 3-year plan. For example, when I mentioned the fact that we were at Swansea, a long-term body shop job, we were working alongside one other company there called the 1900 Group. And our staff were slightly unhappy because they were paying their staff more than we were, giving them bonuses. And they duly paid the price. Bovis, the owner, decided to flog them off. They were losing money. And we bought this company. Primarily what we did, we bought 15 program at Swansea. So we had something like 25, 30 people at Swansea working for 3 or 4 years. And that was a terrific acquisition. It was purely opportunistic. When we were in Australia, we had a subsidiary there. And our former major shareholder, Planning Research Corporation, had a company there working in commercial work. And they decided Australia was not for them, wasn't their kind of country. And we knew GRC, of course, and they rang us up and said, look, are you interested in buying us? And we did. We negotiated a good price. So there we were. There was one, interestingly, it wasn't part of a policy, but it was certainly very valuable to us. We were fairly naked in the IBM area. We didn't really have any IBM expertise. Or indeed very much commercial expertise. We didn't really have any sort of grey hair in the company. And there was a small company, TC Hudson Limited, set up by the former chairman of IBM UK, with such people, all senior IBMers. And they simply approached us and said, look, Tom Hudson simply wanted to get out of the business. He was tired of doing this. And we picked up this group of excellent people who did not compete in any way. They just opened up a new area of work. But as I said, we were basically expanding by taking on new people. You had Sweden as another example. We wanted to go to Sweden as a matter of policy. And we were looking at recruiting a Swede to head up an office in Stockholm and so on and so on. And then it turned out there was a small company headed up by this great guy who wanted, we've got tax problems like they all had in Sweden in those days, and he wanted to somehow work in a more international environment for purposes of, I can't really respect the word for this, money transfers and so on. And he was delighted to sell his company to us. But acquisitions, of course, different now. I mean, many companies, probably even Logic today, that acquisitions and moving into new areas is a very, very big part of the policy of the company. And indeed, it probably contributes more growth than actual internal organic growth. It's probably easier to acquire people and a business area by acquisition is to grow into it today. But that's a sign of the change of the times rather than a change of the attitude.
The trouble is about acquisitions is you tend to lose the company ethos fairly quickly. Because the companies you acquire, if they are any good, have their own ethos. And they bring it with them. I mean, very noticeable one in Capsule. We didn't actually acquire everybody until we floated. We had some fairly good quality. But I suppose the biggest group that ever came to us was Cap Scientific, which was Ockenden and Ferreira and Co. and Chisholm. And they brought a lot of guys with them. And they changed the ethos inside Cap to a sort of blend of a rather disgruntled Psychon who've not been allowed to do what they do, and now came in full of beans hooray, we're in a completely brand new open situation that show how good we are. But they were showing how good they were in the size of the Cap Scientific by itself. They wanted to prove their bit was a really good bit. Now trying to integrate that into the rest of the company was a very, very long business. And the way you did it in the end, to make the senior guys fairly senior managers, but to see slightly wider than just scientific, and people like that, okay, good at that. But it took a lot of assimilating, a lot of assimilating. If, however, you go and acquire somebody who is in a tangential business, that we did with Yard, that worked brilliantly because they were in a field we knew nothing about at all. They were highly technical, very nice guys, all working up in Glasgow. And they fitted just like that because we didn't try and pull them in. We said, you can't be in Yard, you can't call yourself Yard, you put yourself in Yard. And that worked extremely well.
What were your synergies from that track?
Yard?
Yeah.
Oh, defence, yeah. Yes. In fact, it was really Cap Scientific you found them. And so you thought, chaps.
I have to admit, we just bought Bureau contracts. We bought the Bureau contract we used to calculate what it would cost us to sell that amount of revenue, and that's how much it was better place. And the software house, we bought people, and we calculated how much it would cost us to recruit those people and train them. That was the price we paid for that. But it was opportunistic.
You look at Richard Holloway's LinkedIn. There's acquisitions all over pages and pages of that.
I've been out of the...
Just read this one first. I'm trying a different answer to this. Because 15 years ago I retired. I spent a few months off thinking that I really retired on a Friday, having done an old work, start. Tried to do something different. And I didn't like growing tulips, playing golf. And one of the things I did was to try and see if I could go back, as it were, to doing those things concerned with when I was a small part of a business. And I worked for the Department of Trade and Industry on an honorary basis. And over the next 12 years, tried to answer the question that's been put here and saw 1,400 people on a one-to-one basis. A few times for some people, many times for other ones. And over that period, and particularly towards the end of it, I thought, have I done any good? Was this just an absolute waste of time? And thought through the people who I had seen at different stages in their progression. And a few of these are sage. There's a man who, in Newcastle, was running a printing business and came across a situation. It doesn't matter to go into that, but he's probably now running the business with the largest accounting packages being sold, 250,000 in this country. And Passion, you know all about Passion, knew the situation, but there was a time when he came as an individual with a few people saying, can you help by just considering what I'm doing? There's Learning Tree International, who I think, I just was reading this morning, saying that they now are the largest trainers who exclusively do training. You don't have any spin-off people around the side, so they had a speciality that when you went to be taught there, you knew you weren't going to be discreetly listening to sales talk about hardware and software packages or whatever. And a completely different one. A company called Dartmouth, the Queen's Grocers, because they supply the Queen in winter with tea and things. And they have found that, in fact, they could not solve the problem of an extended family running a small shop by small, half a dozen, 8 or 10 people. You all know the only people at present that can run that sort of shop with an extended family, because all the people you know won't work from 8 till late. And so they now got into the property business. And what was the thing about many of those? Something that Ryan said just now. They learn how to think. Because it's the most difficult thing. You arrange everything, you've got the time, you've got everything, and you find every possible excuse for not doing it. And the sort of people we've got here are the sort of people who somehow manage to get that time. And how are you going to engender more of it? I'm still not sure, because those examples I pick out of the 1,400 people that I saw, there's very few more than that. And I don't know whether I should say to myself, I should have got better at growing tulips, or, yes, that was something that was worthwhile. And I don't believe it's changing very much. My only comment really was about the cake business, because I was trained over the years to start thinking about this, is can't do very well with cakes. And what about mincing up some meat and putting it together and selling that? Can you make a better one of those and sell that? Well, same argument would apply. What you can sell
can only find the method of doing it. And I know that looking at that problem at the time of PCs in ICL, thinking about how could I get a sales force of the type you've all been describing, who were looking for high pay and big challenges, how could I get those people to sell these products? And I thought, God, we've got to sell 1 million of them to make the same sort of thing as we can get on a 1908. How
But I
can
do
change
suspect that most of our pioneers here found very little time for sitting down and thinking during those desperate years. It must have been a frantic life, wasn't it?
They were very quick thinkers.
They're like stars, like me.
I think there was a pace at which we worked in small numbers, which didn't allow too much time for what today we have grand descriptions of business planning or business development. But there was always an eye watching for opportunities, whether they were acquisitions or whether they were just absorbing a new base of customers and bureau contract. There was an eye on the future. I think that took place in all the companies, however hard we worked. The characteristic I remember was you've got 62 people who are free symptom. And that drove you to identify opportunities.
I think we at least went very much for I use the phrase, I think, the consensual learning principle. And we certainly tried to work to a very coherent set of principles. And that was largely driven by Del Vaughan, who had such a firm conviction that we had such a set of principles. That one of our major problems when he was minute taking in the executive committee was that every discussion done into group policy was reaffirmed. Because he was completely clear about what the principles were. He took it for granted that we were just reaffirming. I think that was something we consciously did do through the meetings I mentioned and so forth. There was a lot of effort went into thinking those kind of structural thoughts. And we had ratios and numbers we applied to this.
I suspect you all spent a lot of time thinking together with your senior management, did you? I mean, relative to other industries at the time, this process of creating a consensus amongst most of the senior staff seems to have been a feature of this operation.
I think, Brian, that to some extent it can be overdone. I think sometimes we overdo this democracy consensus thing where everybody would have their 4-penneth or 6-penneth in many cases. You would spend a long time agonizing about something, listening to every objection, some of which the very bright people we're talking about sitting in some committee or other. And so people had very valid points, and this would cause one to back off. And very often decisions were deferred or not made simply because one could not arrive at a uniform consensus. Or indeed, there'd be a political decision made by virtue of the fact that somebody would be afraid to do something by virtue of if it went wrong, there'd be 3 people quick to say, I told you so. So in many instances, I think the entrepreneurial activity where one person has the power to say, look, we are going to do it this way, and it may well be wrong. On the other hand, if I get 4 out of 5 right, then I'm doing pretty well. Well, 3 out of 5.
You really got one.
With hindsight, the way of doing things, I can certainly think of times where we spent too much time on this consensus.
Yes, I think this is a question of consensual principles, not of consensual decisions. In other words, what Barney has referred to a couple of times as the ethos of the company. That's what you worked on, because that meant that you could delegate decisions quite safely, because people would be taking them within a framework which you had all hammered out. But individual decisions, well, I wouldn't dream of doing those democratically. I don't. one of the things, I said I learned some things in the civil service, and one of the things I learned were two things, they were both related. One was that you can prove anything in a minute if you don't have to put numbers in it. And the other is that logic is what enables you to show that your gut feeling is correct. Similar principles apply.
We had a variant of that democratic principle. It wasn't, probably in a lot of people's experience as well, probably in yours, but we used to have things called management meetings chaired by Alex. Alex would say, well, the next thing is, are we going to do plan A or plan B? I favour plan A, but what does everybody else think? Everybody else said, I favour plan B. He said, fine, actually, we're going to do plan A. And that's a sort of benevolent autocracy or benevolent oligarchy. It seemed to work pretty well for quite a long time.
I have two questions. They concern what I think somebody referred to as human resources. I like Brian's peer reviewing, and what I want to get to is with later stages, you've hired these people, you've got them working, perhaps you've got 25 of them working in Swansea. Now you've got two problems. One is, how do you identify your leaders, your designers? Because some of them are working for somebody else in another place. And how do you identify the losers at the bottom and get rid of them? So these are the sort of two questions. With your staff, once you have them, how do you pick out your leaders and how do you pick out people you don't want?
Is there a hidden sort of implication in your question that you're justifying the need for human resources directors and scientific methods and
not all about scientific methods, and I only use the term human resources in jest. So
okay, well, I'm speaking of small companies now, but using the example you gave, 25 people writing a COBOL at Swansea, enjoying curry and chips every lunchtime. I found that, okay, we had a project manager there, first class man, we trust his judgment. But I found that by knowing the project manager and having some degree of knowledge of the people, I actually managed to know quite a lot of people directly. One was able, in a purely subjective way, sometimes wrong, I'm sure, to say, well, look, I think he is a leader. I think he's management material. I think he's probably not going anywhere. And there's no science about this. It was just that gut feel of people. People knowing people. People relating to people. It was a purely chemical process which, like I say, applied there. And probably, I'm sure it can't apply today. Large companies.
We process everybody through the successive training courses. They've all got, well, no, they've got successive training by peer group information. But we did actually process everybody through the successive group familiarisation course, junior training course, potential leaders course, potential managers course, we just processed them all through.
What year was that?
And as far as I know, it's still going on, but it's certainly going on one. We just did all that.
I think that the newer companies from 68 onwards did that.
No, we started in 65.
Within the early days, it was a bit like Len said. In SPL, there was Ken Barnes, myself, Keith Davis, and David Rodway. And each of us had a group of projects for which we were responsible. Every project we handled was allocated to one of us. Every single one. So we knew those projects quite well. And we made the sort of judgment that Len described. There's no more we can do that.
Question. I know two software houses which weren't successful. And I think it was because they, in fact, had too many things to think about. They failed to chase the main chance and let their efforts go with the things which were quite important. My question is, you're obviously very conscious of the things which were successful for your companies. Can you look back and think of any things and say, well, I'm glad we brought it down, or I'm glad we dropped it down, or whatever? How did you stay focused? I mean, Len made some comment, I think, about about learning things on packages or anything like that?
I think most of the time we sucked in the soul. We didn't have quite the solid feeling that they had about packages. We dabbled in packages, we made a business out of packages. It didn't last very long. It lasted about 10 or 12 years. And then we discovered the absolute rule about the package business, which is if somebody asks you as a franchisee to sell these packages for it, and you make a blindly success of it, he takes it over. And if you make a neat cock-up of it, he takes it over. That's really the end of the package, as far as we're concerned. No, the one that sticks in the can or anything else is about Microsoft, which is going to $4 million developing an interface system for microcomputers, which communicates about much more than and that really led the company to death. And we kept going at it, and Don was no part of it.
See you in another 10 years.
That's the only big disaster we have, was where one man was absolutely focused on doing one thing and one thing only. Everybody ran and saying, no, but that's not our business, we're not in that sort of business. And it very nearly broke the company. But grace of God, it just didn't. He was a very salutary man.
I think what Len described in his talk, the trick was, and this you only know in retrospect, I suppose, is to stop doing something that's losing money.
Yeah.
Because I think all of us tried different things at different times. I know we nearly bought a main farm, which in those days was running into nearly £1 million, on a really stupid assessment of what we could do with it. And we came out of that days before we were signed. So it was stopping doing something silly that often led to your success, rather than big errors.
It struck me that maybe there might be an assumption that the entrepreneurs who failed because they obviously didn't know about money and that sort of thing, but it might be because they did know about money. Because it struck me that you have the conditions for going for quality inherent in the situation you were. First of all, you had total commitment. Secondly, was new technology. You're also tackling problems using computers and mathematics, which was by definition going for a quality solution, wasn't it? So by definition, you were in a situation where you were going for quality, and you're doing what doctors do and teachers do and everybody else do. They leave their careers to worry about the money and the career structure, and they go and do the job. So therefore, by definition, you were in a situation where you were inevitably doing the quality thing, the quality way.
I think I speak for all of us when I say that the great fear we all had was performing badly on a contract, because that was going to spread like wildfire, and it would get known straight away, and people would not buy from it. We all shared that attitude. However we were organised, we feared the project would went bad.
And I think our private claim was we never actually left the project, never walked away from
We never walked away from the project.
Didn't work. They all would. They had to.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, this leads to a question about rate of failure of software. Would it be possible to give a percentage from your experience about the success, forget failure, how many projects you managed or you dealt with was successful in your period, if you don't mind?
When we talk about early 60s now?
Early 60s.
Well,
yes.
I think in terms of failure from the client's point of view, I think quite a few. I think that we would do the job and make a profit on it and do quite a good job. But very often the client, what he'd got was a system that actually he didn't really need, or was obsolete, or was changed because of a change of manager. The new manager came in and threw that out. So I think maybe facetiously, I implied that clients have got their hands burdened because of our failure. Well, to some extent that was true, but also to some extent because the client, the user of computers in those days, was learning the hard way himself.
I wouldn't want you to think that we made mistakes.
No, I didn't mention the word mistakes. How much is success around here? Thank you.
In terms of your question relating to us as software companies and our failures, I think the comment about quality and profit was it, but they are scientific sort of service or defence establishments. They were intelligent, scientific people who spoke our language, and we were almost invariably successful in terms of being profitable. We didn't make too much profit, I have to say.
Quite enough.
Wage bill coming in. We had a very, very high hit rate, but where we moved away from that into certainly low value jobs, we almost always lost. We could never do cheap jobs and make a profit. We could never do the easy jobs. So we kept away from a lot of that after we learned that.
I think it was possible to do a project well and have a dissatisfied customer. It was certainly possible to do that.
I can remember several projects where they were technically perfectly okay. CAG projects, and there's nothing like this technical sort of thing. I think all my colleagues probably do it. We constrain ourselves to simply think about payroll. But I can remember a number of occasions where the project was in fact doomed from the beginning in a sense, because it didn't matter if it worked. It wasn't going to do what the customer expected. And as we grew more confident, we tried to tell them that. But they didn't believe us. And so, as I said earlier, if that's what the client wants, you take the money and lie down.
So it was a major problem for industry, wasn't it? That customers of all type, and I would include the scientific, highly intelligent customers as well as the mass-produced customers and so on, didn't really understand what their business needed out of computing. In a sense, it's been a sort of learning process.
I myself don't feel that learned. I have a brother, very fine businessman, runs now did run a big business, now runs a small business of his own. And the thing is the same problem that I experienced 40 years ago. It's a complete inability to imagine what the computer could do for you. I mean, I could see that it could do payroll, and no doubt scientific people could see that it could solve an equation and they knew they wanted it solved. But it was the possibilities of doing things in a completely different way, which is not really surprising.
It's the humans in the company in relation to the system, which so often seem to me to be well.
I think what we're talking about is something too that's fairly general to business decision making. We used to have applied to computer projects something which was very simple. We jokingly used to call Conan theory, in which you had a cone that went like that way, which was understanding the level of uncertainty, and a cone that went that way, parallel with it, which was the level of expenditure. And it's a very simple model, but it was very useful, and you see it again and again in business, where the time spent conceptualizing, understanding, thinking, which some people are good at, some people find very sensible and can't do, about a project, about business, whatever it might be, before you really seriously start going down the decision tree of commitment, is absolutely crucial, and very often is underdone. Sometimes because people are just, they don't find it congenial, and they just want to say, oh, we're just sitting around wasting time. Why don't we get on and do something? A great disease I find politicians.
Yes.
Who began to think, well, this is just, it's just sitting around drinking cups of tea. But actually, it was the thinking before the doing. I think that applies to most projects.
I tell you where we did make mistakes, Brian. We would design a system, it would fill the specification, and we would deliver it. And we would not take any account of it being received. All of the people, organizational issues that sat in the customer were distant from us.
But no one was prepared for that.
Right. The reasons are, as you say, that was why many things failed.
Last question on that?
Sorry, could I observe, following up that point, I've worked for ICL for a number of years, and I perceived success in a computer situation, development of a system of any reasonable size, needed 4 attributes. You had to have a champion in the user, preferably at director level, but fairly senior manager level, who actually was committed and who understood the business well enough to know that this was actually going to work if the system was done. Then you had to have someone who could design it well, who could work out how a computer system and the data flows and so on would all work. You might need, if it was at all technical, and in the early days you definitely needed at least one technician who could make it work technically and do the key bits of programming and data acquisition and make sure it worked in the timescale too. Again, people produce systems which work perfectly, except that it took 48 hours to do work that had to be done in 8. And that was a practical disaster. And then you had to have a manager on the level who actually got all the people together. I saw you talking about the managers. I didn't see you talking about the systems design people at one end, and perhaps the software house is not the right place to have systems designers of that sort. You didn't talk about the technical whiz, the people who really knew how to make databases go and things like that.
The secret of their success was that they were actually better at thinking about the overall system than the people who were trying to flog particular black boxes. But let them answer. Well, did you really have no system thinking in your work?
A large amount of our development was based on precisely your word, champion. A lot of our work was based on a champion emerging, and that champion finding a sponsor on the board or whatever, and having the right mix of people we talk about, and away we go on systems. One example I can give you, who actually turned out to be soundly, ultimately a great financial disaster for us, which was developing a database system called Rapport, which we tried to sell for a number of years. It was a superb system, it had a champion. However, commercial reasons, I think it was a bit of bad luck as well, we didn't sell it. But nevertheless, the climate in the company, the software company, was very much for doing that kind of thing, system designers with champions. So I wouldn't agree that the software house environment then was the wrong one for doing that kind of work.
We had a particularly acute version because CMG was actually like a flat golden cake. Vertically, it was divided between England and Holland, but horizontally, it was divided between Bureau and software house. And we were our own customer as a software, as a Bureau. And everything our boys wrote actually did actually have to run very often on our own machines. So something like our major investment management package, which we wrote originally to the commercial union, we ran people ran it both in-house and we ran it on our machines for smaller ones for people who didn't want to do it. So we definitely had to think in terms of the system actually working on the ground in practical terms.
I think what happened is that after the era we described today, in the 70s, when you hit the first recession that the industry had known, we had to sell. We had to go out and get orders. It was a new experience. And what happened was that you developed people in the company who proposed things to people, just go and respond to inquiries. And at that stage, you created a lot of champions. Champions not only of new business, but champions of new ideas. And that took place, I guess, from the early 70s onwards.
Rob misunderstood the question's point. I thought he meant the champions in the user side.
Yes, I really do.
The user side. The job for a user. Those 4 attributes should be present in the user. And therefore, the champion, if you're like a project leader in the software house, must interface with the champion of the project and the user. And similarly, down to all 4 things. And it was occasionally the case where, for instance, on the programming, the user had no programmers at all, and you had them all. So the interface was very difficult if the project manager was capable. Provided the champion and the project manager were talking head to head, then it tended to be a successful project. Which you're quite right, the users had to have that program.
Well, time has run on, and it's, I think, time to break this up. Though I suspect we could go on for a long time. I myself would love to understand why, at least in the UK, we have been so unsuccessful at the package relative to the bespoke. And it isn't just in Seattle that they can make vast amounts of it, or SAP has now become a world leader. And I think there is some evidence that these games firms you're talking about, who are in a sense package firms, are able to make large sums within the UK environment. But perhaps those of us who are joining some of our speakers from Bike to Eat now can go into that. Could I just say that I think it came out very clearly this afternoon that one of the extraordinary features of this generation of software houses was the wonderful atmosphere within them. I mean, when you contrast the atmosphere with the alternative hardware firms of the period, I think you can see that I suspect all our pioneers recognized that the creation of the right atmosphere for these high-quality people to enjoy their life was really a very crucial part of their success. And it's always seemed to me that it is that that distinguished this particular industry from the other industries around. I remember very clearly, I was very privileged to sit in on one meeting of one of these firms where they were arguing about their strategy, and the argument went on all the afternoon, and they couldn't focus on what was the right way to go. And finally, the chairman said, well, what the hell does it matter, providing we enjoy ourselves? Maybe that was part of the secret of success. Anyway, it's quite clear that there were a wonderful set of characters who created and ran these firms in the early days, and we're very grateful to them. Now, if I can just deal with the announcements, the next lecture is on the